Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories. Tonight we're moving slowly into something that does not announce itself clearly in the ancient texts, something that never receives a single name, never stands at the centre of a myth, and is never described in one complete passage. Instead, it exists at the edges of language, in careful omissions, in repeated warnings, and in descriptions that stop just short of explanation. The Sumerian tablets, when read patiently and without modern expectations imposed upon them, suggest a view of the cosmos that is far less open and far less forgiving than we tend to imagine. Not a universe of endless expansion and exploration, but a structured system with limits, barriers, and places set aside for very specific purposes. Before we settle fully into this exploration, take a moment to make yourself comfortable. Lower the lights if you like. Let the room grow quieter. If you find this kind of slow history soothing, you can like the video or subscribe to the channel, but only if it genuinely adds something to your evenings. Secretum. Histories is about listening carefully to the past without forcing it to sound like us. Now, with that settled, we can begin easing into the question that will guide everything that follows, even when it is never stated directly. The Sumerians did not imagine the heavens as an open wilderness. They did not picture the sky as a place of freedom, travel, or limitless motion. Their universe was ordered, layered, and governed. Every realm had a function, every movement had consequences, and most importantly, not every place was meant to be reached, visited, or returned from. Modern readers often approach ancient cosmology expecting wonder, expecting myths of ascent and exploration, expecting stories of gods moving freely between worlds. But the earliest Mesopotamian texts resist that expectation. They speak instead of boundaries that must not be crossed, domains that are assigned rather than discovered, and regions of existence that are defined not by what they contain, but by what they prevent. In the Sumerian worldview, space was not empty. It was structured. The sky was not a void, but a solid realm with gates, thresholds, and guardians. The earth was not floating freely, but anchored between forces above and below. Beneath the surface lay waters that were ancient, restrained, and dangerous. Above the sky were realms that were described but rarely entered, and beyond certain points, the language becomes cautious. The tablets do not celebrate what lies there. They warn about it. They define it by distance, silence, and permanence. When modern readers encounter references to distant celestial bodies in these texts, there is often a temptation to project modern astronomy backward, to imagine planets as destinations, as places one might travel to or come from. But this assumption does not align with how the Sumerians wrote. When the tablets describe certain celestial regions, they do not frame them as homes, colonies, or worlds like Earth. Instead, they are described as places of confinement, separation, and irreversible placement. The verbs matter. Entities are sent there. They are assigned there. They are placed and remain. Return is rarely implied, and when it is treated as extraordinary and disruptive. This is where the idea of a planet-sized prison begins to emerge, not as a single claim, but as a pattern. A location that exists within the cosmic order, that has a defined role, and that role is not creation or habitation, but containment. The Sumerians did not use our word for prison, but they didn't need to. They described function instead of label, a realm that receives those who must be removed, a place associated with judgment that does not end in death, a destination that is distant, fixed, and deliberately inaccessible. In the earliest layers of the tablets, punishment does not always mean destruction. It often means separation, the removal of a being from the functioning order of the world and their placement somewhere they can no longer interfere. This applies to gods as well as humans. The texts are very clear that divine beings are not immune to consequence. They can be restrained, they can be bound, they can be assigned to domains from which they cannot escape without permission. And crucially, these domains are not metaphorical states of mind or moral conditions. They are described spatially. They exist somewhere. The Sumerians conceived of judgment as administrative rather than emotional. There is little language of rage or vengeance in these early descriptions. Instead, there is process. Councils convene. Decisions are made. Fates are fixed. And then something happens that cannot be undone. The condemned is not annihilated. They are relocated. Their influence is neutralized not by ending their existence, but by placing them somewhere they can no longer act. This is a far more unsettling concept than simple destruction, because it implies permanence without resolution. As we move through the tablets that describe the structure of the cosmos, a recurring theme appears. Certain places are defined by what does not happen there. No growth, no exchange, no communication. These are not realms of chaos. They are stable. They persist. They are part of the cosmic design. Stability in this context is not a virtue. It is a method of control. A prison does not need to be violent to be effective. It only needs to be inescapable. The Sumerian scribes were precise in their language. When they describe the heavens, they differentiate between regions associated with movement and those associated with stasis. Some celestial bodies govern cycles. They move predictably, regulating time, agriculture and ritual. Others are mentioned rarely, without cycles, without seasonal association, without ritual celebration. These bodies are not invoked for blessing. They are acknowledged, noted, and then left alone. Silence surrounds them in the texts, and silence in ancient writing is rarely accidental. This silence becomes more meaningful when contrasted with how other realms are treated. Cities are described in detail. Temples are named. Gods are given epithets, functions, personalities. Even the underworld, grim as it is, receives careful description. Its gates are named. Its judges are listed. Its rules are outlined. But certain cosmic locations receive none of this. They are referenced only in relation to what is sent there, not what exists there. The absence suggests intentional restraint. A refusal to elaborate, a recognition that some places are not meant to be understood, only acknowledged. The idea that a planet-sized prison exists within the Sumerian cosmos does not emerge from sensational claims or modern reinterpretations. It emerges from structure, from the way the universe is organized in the texts, from the fact that punishment does not always terminate existence, and that distance itself is used as a tool of control. A place large enough to contain divine beings, far enough to prevent interference, and fixed enough to remain outside the normal rhythms of cosmic life. This concept challenges the modern assumption that ancient peoples viewed the heavens with optimism or longing. The Sumerians did not look up and see opportunity. They saw authority. They saw order. They saw regions governed by rules as strict as those that governed their cities. To them, the sky was not an escape. It was part of the system that kept everything in its place. As this exploration continues, we will move gradually outward, examining how distance is described, how prohibition is encoded in language, and how certain celestial bodies function not as homes or origins, but as endpoints. We will look at who is sent away, why death is not always the final sentence, and what it means to be placed somewhere forever without being destroyed. The tablets do not explain this openly. They do not need to. They assume the reader understands what placement means in a universe built on order. Nothing here arrives suddenly. The idea forms slowly, piece by piece, as the scribes intended. And as we continue, the boundaries of the Sumerian cosmos will become clearer, not wider, revealing a universe that was designed not only to create and sustain, but also to contain. The Sumerians did not imagine their world drifting freely through an endless void. That idea, so familiar to us now, would have felt deeply strange to them. In their understanding, the world was surrounded, enclosed, and held in place by forces that were older than humanity and stronger than any city or king. Space was not an empty backdrop where objects happened to move. It was a structured environment, carefully arranged, layered, and restrained. Nothing floated aimlessly. Everything existed where it did because it had been placed there. When the earliest tablets describe the shape of the world, they do not begin with stars or distant lights. They begin with boundaries. The Earth is described as resting within a larger system, bordered above and below, pressed between domains that are both sustaining and threatening. The sky is not infinite. It has limits. The Earth is not isolated. It is surrounded, and beneath everything lies a presence that is never fully absent, a reminder that order is maintained, not guaranteed. In Sumerian thought, the Earth was imagined as a disk or broad landmass, not because of mathematical measurement, but because of experience. Their cities rose from flat plains. The horizon stretched outward in every direction without interruption. When they looked around, the land appeared stable, wide, and continuous. When they looked upward, however, they did not see emptiness, they saw a surface. The sky was conceived as a solid dome, sometimes described as metallic, sometimes crystalline, but always substantial. It was not a place one passed through casually. It was a barrier that separated realms. Above this dome were waters, held back by the sky itself. Below the earth were waters as well, ancient and heavy, pressing upward. The world in this model was suspended between two seas, not floating freely, but trapped in a careful balance. The earth existed because these waters were restrained. If the restraint failed, everything would collapse back into the primordial state. Flood myths were not simply stories about rain. They were reminders of what happens when boundaries weaken. This conception of space as layered and enclosed shaped how the Sumerians thought about everything beyond their immediate world. The heavens were not an open frontier. They were an upper level of administration. Gods did not roam freely between worlds. They occupied assigned domains. Movement between realms required permission, justification, and consequence. When a deity crossed a boundary, the texts mark it as significant, often dangerous. The stars, which modern observers might interpret as distant suns scattered through infinite space, were understood as fixed markers embedded in the sky. They were not moving freely. They followed prescribed paths. Their motions were repetitive, reliable, and meaningful. Certain stars were associated with gods, but this association did not imply that the gods lived inside them as inhabitants. Rather, the stars functioned as signals, indicators of divine presence or attention. They marked time. They regulated seasons. They reinforced order. Planets, as wandering lights that moved differently from the fixed stars, were more troubling. Their irregular motion drew attention. They did not behave like the rest of the sky. In later Mesopotamian traditions, these movements became objects of careful observation and omen interpretation. But even in the earliest layers, irregularity in the heavens suggested agency, intervention, or disruption. A body that did not follow the established pattern was not neutral. What is important here is that none of these celestial objects were described as destinations. The language of travel is absent. The sky is something that covers, not something one enters. When ascent appears in myth, it is limited, controlled, and often temporary. Humans do not journey into the heavens and return with knowledge. Gods rarely descend fully, and when they do, the event is destabilizing. This closed nature of space is reinforced by how the Sumerians described the edges of the world. Beyond the cultivated land lay the steppe, a place of danger and unpredictability. Beyond that lay mountains, often associated with hostility, foreignness, or divine presence. Beyond even those were realms that were not mapped at all. The unknown was not romanticized. It was treated cautiously. To go too far was to leave the protection of order. This mindset extended upward. Just as the desert marked the edge of civilization horizontally, the sky marked the edge of permitted existence vertically. The idea that something could exist beyond the sky was accepted but not explored. The tablets do not speculate freely about what lies beyond. They simply acknowledge that it exists and that it is not meant for humans. The sense of being surrounded rather than floating also influenced how the Sumerians understood security. Order was something maintained by constant effort. The gods held the sky in place. They regulated the waters. They assigned responsibilities to ensure stability. If they failed, chaos would return. Space itself was part of this system. It was not neutral. It participated in the maintenance of order. In this framework, distance was not merely spatial. It was moral and functional. To be far away was to be removed from influence, from communication, from participation. When a being was sent far from the earth, this was not an act of exile in the modern sense. It was administrative removal, a reassignment within the cosmic structure. This makes the idea of a distant, isolated, celestial body functioning as a place of containment far more plausible within Sumerian thought than it might appear to modern readers. The universe already functioned as a closed system. Certain places were accessible, others were not. Some regions were integrated into daily life through ritual and observation. Others were acknowledged only in passing. The Sumerians did not describe the cosmos as expanding. They described it as held by laws, by gods, by agreements made at the beginning of time. When something threatened that stability, the response was not exploration or adaptation. It was removal. The offending force was placed somewhere it could no longer disrupt the system. Language reflects this. Words associated with sending, placing, fixing, and binding appear frequently in relation to cosmic order. Words associated with wandering, discovery, or exploration are rare or absent. Even the gods are constrained by their assigned roles. Enlil governs air and authority. Enki governs waters and wisdom. Utu governs justice and light. These are not suggestions, they are obligations. When the texts refer to something being placed in the sky or beyond it, the implication is permanence. This is not a temporary banishment, it is a structural decision. The cosmos adjusts and the adjustment remains in place. The idea of a planet-sized prison fits naturally into this worldview. It would not be described as such. It would not need dramatic language. It would simply exist as part of the architecture. The ancients imagined space not as freedom, but as function. Every region had a purpose. Some nurtured life, some maintained order. Some existed to receive what could no longer remain within the system. The absence of curiosity about these distant places is telling. They were not meant to be understood. They were meant to work. As we move further into the tablets, this sense of enclosure becomes more pronounced. The cosmos tightens rather than opens. Boundaries multiply. Warnings accumulate. Silence increases around certain locations. The world feels less like a stage and more like a machine, carefully assembled and carefully regulated. Understanding this closed conception of space is essential, because without it, later descriptions are easily misunderstood. A distant celestial body might appear to us as a potential home, a source, or a destination. To the Sumerians, it was more likely a terminal point, a place where something ends, not begins. This shift in perspective will matter as we continue. The idea of containment only makes sense in a universe that is already enclosed, and the Sumerian universe was exactly that. The Sumerian tablets do not describe boundaries as empty spaces. A boundary, in their understanding, was never a gap or a transition zone, where one thing gradually became another. It was a line of control. It was a threshold that existed to separate, to regulate, and to prevent. When the scribes wrote about the edges of realms, whether between earth and sky, life and death, order and chaos, they consistently framed those edges as active, guarded, and deliberate. Nothing passed through them accidentally. In modern thinking, boundaries are often imagined as abstract or symbolic. A border on a map, a line in space, an invisible division that exists only because we agree it does. For the Sumerians, boundaries were real. They had substance. They were enforced. They could be opened or closed, but only by authority. and once closed, they remained closed unless a decision was made at the highest level of the cosmic hierarchy. This is especially important when considering how the tablets describe the space between realms. The boundary between earth and sky, for example, is never described as a gradual thinning of air or a fading into emptiness. It is described as a firm separation. The sky is held up, the earth is held down. The space between them exists because something was done to create it, and because something continues to maintain it. When that maintenance falters, catastrophe follows. The act of separation itself is remembered as violent. Heaven and earth were once joined. Their separation required force. This tells us something fundamental about how boundaries were understood. They do not arise naturally, they are imposed. Order does not emerge on its own, it must be enforced continuously. A boundary, once created, is a tool. It defines what belongs where and what must never cross. When the texts speak of the gates of heaven or the gates of the underworld, they are not using metaphor. Gates imply structure, control, and authority. A gate can be opened. A gate can be shut. A gate has guardians. It exists to regulate passage. The fact that the cosmos is filled with gates tells us that movement between realms was not free. It required permission, purpose, and consequence. Even gods were subject to this system. A deity descending from the heavens is not described casually. It is marked, explained, and often justified. A god entering the underworld does so with great risk and only under extraordinary circumstances. Return is never guaranteed. The famous descent narratives emphasize this danger precisely because the boundary is real. Crossing it threatens the stability of the entire system. The space beyond the visible sky is treated with even greater caution. The tablets rarely describe it directly. Instead, they define it by its function. It is a place where certain things are sent and remain. It does not interact with the world. It does not participate in cycles. It does not contribute to growth or decay. It is closed. This closure is not described as emptiness. Silence does not mean absence. In the logic of the tablets, silence often means restraint. What is not spoken of is often what must not be disturbed. When a realm receives little description, it is not because it is insignificant, but because it is dangerous or final. The scribes knew how to describe worlds in great detail. When they chose not to, that choice mattered. The boundary beyond the sky appears to function in a similar way to the boundary beneath the earth. The underworld is not chaos. It is organized. It has judges. It has rules. It has permanence. Souls do not wander freely. They are confined. The underworld is closed not because it is inaccessible, but because it is designed to hold what enters it. What differs is scale. The underworld holds the dead. The distant celestial boundary appears to hold something else. Not ordinary souls, but beings whose existence cannot be allowed to end, yet whose presence cannot be tolerated within the active world. This is where the idea of containment without destruction becomes essential. In the Sumerian worldview, destruction is inefficient. It removes responsibility but does not resolve imbalance. Containment, on the other hand, neutralizes without erasing. A contained being still exists. Its fate remains fixed. Its influence is severed. This is a far more controlled outcome. The language used around divine punishment reflects this logic. Offending gods are bound, stationed, or assigned. They are not always killed. In fact, death for gods is rare and often temporary. What persists is removal, placement, fixing a being somewhere it can no longer interfere. The boundary that holds such beings must therefore be absolute. It cannot leak, it cannot allow escape, it cannot be porous. This is why the texts emphasize closure. The boundary is not empty. It is sealed. It is maintained. It is part of the architecture of the cosmos. Modern readers sometimes struggle with this because we're accustomed to thinking of space as inherently open. In modern physics, space expands. Objects move freely unless acted upon by forces. For the Sumerians, space was already acted upon. It was shaped. It was constrained. Forces did not move through empty space. They operated within a system that limited them. This difference in worldview cannot be overstated. A closed boundary implies intention. Someone designed it. Someone maintains it. Someone decides what passes and what does not. The universe, in this model, is not neutral. It is governed. When the tablets describe certain celestial bodies as distant, fixed, or silent, they are not merely noting astronomical features, they are indicating status. These bodies do not participate in the ongoing life of the cosmos. They do not send signs. They do not regulate time. They do not receive offerings. They simply exist, unmoving in their function. This is not how beneficent or neutral objects are described. The sun gives light. The moon governs months. The stars guide seasons. These bodies are active. They engage with the world. A closed boundary does none of this. It receives and holds. The Sumerian scribes were deeply concerned with balance. Every force required a counterforce. Every action produced a reaction. When imbalance threatened, it had to be corrected. Sometimes correction took the form of flood or famine. Sometimes it took the form of decree, and sometimes it took the form of permanent removal. A closed boundary provides a solution that does not destabilize the rest of the system. It isolates the problem. It prevents recurrence. It does not require ongoing intervention. Once something is placed there, the cosmos can continue functioning. The fear associated with these boundaries is subtle, but present. The texts do not dramatize them. They normalize them. That normalization is more unsettling than overt fear. It suggests that containment is routine, that the cosmos includes places specifically designed to hold what cannot be resolved. This also explains why descriptions of such places are restrained. To describe them too vividly would be to draw attention. Attention invites interaction. Interaction threatens stability. The safest approach is acknowledgement without elaboration. The boundary beyond the sky is therefore not empty. It is full of purpose. It is closed because it must be. It exists because something required it. And it remains because whatever it holds must not return. As this exploration continues, the nature of what is placed beyond that boundary will become clearer, not through explicit description, but through implication. Through who is sent there, through what actions lead to such placement, through the absence of any story of return. The Sumerian universe does not allow for loose ends. Every decision leaves a trace, every punishment has a location, and every boundary, once closed, becomes part of the permanent structure of existence. The idea that a planet-sized prison exists within this structure is not an exaggeration. It is a logical extension of how the Sumerians understood order, authority, and containment. A closed boundary on a cosmic scale serves the same function as a sealed gate in a city wall or a barred door in a temple complex. It protects the inside by isolating what threatens it. And just as no citizen casually passes through a sealed gate, no being placed beyond a closed cosmic boundary is expected to return. When the Sumerian tablets speak of the sky, they do not do so with admiration or longing. There is no sense of aspiration attached to it, no suggestion that it represents freedom, escape, or possibility. Instead, the sky appears as an administrative space, a controlled domain that exists to regulate what lies beneath it and to separate what must never mix. This difference is subtle, but profound. Where later cultures would imagine the heavens as a realm of reward, transcendence, or ascent, the earliest Mesopotamian texts describe something far more restrained and far less inviting. The sky, in these tablets, is not a destination. It is a ceiling. This is apparent not only in the way the sky is described, but in what is never said about it. Humans do not dream of reaching it. Heroes are not rewarded by dwelling there. Even the gods themselves do not treat it as a place of leisure or freedom. It is a realm of authority, oversight, and separation. To exist in the sky is not to be liberated from the world, but to be bound to a specific function within it. The Sumerians conceived of the sky as solid. This detail alone changes everything. A solid sky is not a metaphor. It implies resistance. It implies that something presses against it, that it holds something back, that it must be maintained. The sky is described as something that can be opened or closed, something that can fail, something that once did not exist in its current form. Its solidity is not accidental. It is the result of deliberate action. When heaven and earth were separated, the act created space, but it also created confinement. The air between earth and sky became a regulated zone, governed by a specific deity, subject to rules and consequences. Above that zone lay the sky itself, a boundary that defined how far influence could extend. Beyond that boundary lay something else entirely, something that did not interact freely with the world below. This layered structure means that the sky functions less like an open expanse and more like a lid. It closes the world in. It prevents upward leakage just as the earth prevents downward collapse. The cosmos is stabilized by being enclosed from both directions. What exists within it operates under rules. What exists beyond it does not participate. The language used in the tablets reinforces this interpretation. When the sky is mentioned, it is often in connection with restraint. Waters are held above it. Forces are kept in check. Decrees are issued from it. Rarely is it associated with movement or exploration. Even celestial phenomena are described as processes occurring within or upon the sky, not through it. Stars are embedded. They are fixed. Their paths are carved, not chosen. Planets move, but their movement is monitored, interpreted, and constrained. They are not free agents. Their irregularity is troubling precisely because it deviates from the expected order of containment. If the sky were imagined as freedom, irregular motion would inspire curiosity. In the Sumerian world view, it inspires caution. Deviations in the sky are read as signs of disruption, warnings that something is out of alignment. This only makes sense in a system where the sky is expected to behave predictably, where it serves as a stabilizing structure rather than an open field. The sky also functions as a barrier between realms of authority. Below it lies the human world, where labor, growth, decay, and mortality dominate. Above it lies the realm of decision, decree, and permanence. Gods who dwell above are not free in the way humans might imagine freedom. They are bound by their roles. They administer, observe, and enforce. Their elevation is not liberation from responsibility. It is assignment to it. This perspective reshapes how we should understand descent myths. When a god descends from the sky, the event is not framed as a visit from a free traveller. It is an intervention. It disrupts the normal containment of realms. The texts mark such moments carefully, often surrounding them with ritual language or consequences. Descent is not casual. It is regulated because the boundary it crosses matters. Ascent, when it occurs at all, is even more constrained. Humans do not ascend freely. When they are taken upward, it is temporary, symbolic, or transformative in a way that removes them from normal existence. There is no narrative of human exploration of the sky, no return journeys filled with knowledge. The sky does not offer enrichment. It offers separation. This absence is telling. The Sumerians were capable of imagination. Their myths are complex, detailed, and emotionally rich. If they had conceived of the sky as a realm of freedom or opportunity, they could have expressed it. They did not. Instead, they consistently treated it as a domain that limits interaction. Containment also appears in the way divine punishment is administered. Gods who offend the cosmic order are not expelled upward into freedom. They are assigned to domains that restrict them. Some are bound to the underworld, others are stationed in remote regions. In each case, the goal is not annihilation, but neutralization. The sky plays a role in this system by serving as a layer that prevents unauthorized movement. The idea that something could be placed in the sky and left there indefinitely fits naturally into this worldview. A place above the world, beyond human reach, sealed by boundaries, monitored by authority, and isolated from the rhythms of life below, would serve perfectly as a containment zone. It would not need constant guarding. Its distance and closure would be enough. This is why descriptions of certain celestial locations feel so restrained. They are acknowledged but not explored. Their existence is accepted but not elaborated. They are not celebrated in hymns. They are not invoked in ritual. They simply are. This neutrality is deceptive. In a culture that imbued nearly everything with symbolic and ritual meaning, neutrality often signals something that must not be engaged. The sky, in this sense, is not an invitation. It is a warning. It marks the limit of where life as we understand it operates. Beyond it lies permanence without participation, a place where time does not cycle, where growth does not occur, where influence does not spread. Containment does not require walls in the modern sense. It requires rules that cannot be broken. The sky embodies those rules. It is not merely physical, it is juridical. It represents the enforcement of cosmic law. This also explains why the sky is often associated with judgment. Decrees come from above. Fates are fixed there. Decisions made in the sky ripple downward, shaping events on Earth. The sky is not reactive, it is authoritative. Authority, by definition, limits freedom. The Sumerian cosmos does not prioritize individual desire, it prioritizes balance. Anything that threatens balance must be managed. Freedom, in the modern sense, is irrelevant. Stability is what matters. The sky exists to preserve that stability. When the tablets hint at distant celestial bodies that do not participate in cycles, that do not send omens, that do not regulate time, they are pointing to locations that exist outside the living system. These bodies are not part of the ongoing negotiation between gods and humans. They do not interact, they contain. A planet-sized prison does not need bars. It needs isolation. It needs permanence. It needs authority backing its role. The sky, as the Sumerians understood it, provides all of this. It encloses the world, defines limits, and holds certain things beyond reach. As we move forward, this understanding will become increasingly important. The tablets do not tell us outright that the sky contains places of punishment. They do not need to. They show us a universe where containment is normal, where removal is preferable to destruction, and where boundaries exist to keep order intact. The sky, in this worldview, is not a promise. It is a mechanism, and mechanisms exist for a reason. In the Sumerian tablets, descent is never a neutral action. It is never a journey undertaken lightly, and it is almost never paired with an expectation of return. When something descends, it does so because a decision has been made, because a boundary has been crossed with intent, or because authority has been exercised. Descent is not movement for its own sake, it is consequence. This alone separates the Sumerian worldview sharply from many later traditions. In much later mythologies, descent is often temporary. Heroes descend into dangerous realms and return wiser. Gods travel downward to intervene and then withdraw again. Even death itself becomes a passage that can be reversed under special conditions. But the earliest Mesopotamian texts do not treat descent this way. Descent marks a narrowing of possibility, not an expansion of it. The direction matters. Upward movement is rare and constrained, but downward movement is final in a way that upward movement never is. This is not accidental. The cosmos, as the Sumerians imagined it, was structured around gravity of order. Things fall into place. They're assigned downward when they no longer belong among the active, governing layers of existence. The clearest example is the underworld. It is entered by descent. It is described repeatedly as a place from which there is no return. The few exceptions that exist only serve to reinforce the rule, because they require extraordinary intervention, deception, or substitution. Even gods do not descend safely. When they do, they lose power. they are stripped, they are judged, and return, when it happens, is costly and destabilizing. What matters here is not the underworld itself, but the logic behind it. The Sumerians did not imagine death as annihilation, they imagined it as relocation. The dead do not vanish, they go somewhere. That somewhere is closed. It does not open itself easily. It does not offer cycles of renewal. It receives and holds. This logic extends beyond death. The tablets apply the same framework to other forms of punishment and containment. When a being descends, it is not being tested. It is being removed from circulation. Its ability to influence the world is reduced or eliminated. The descent is the mechanism by which order is preserved. Language reinforces this. The verbs associated with descent are decisive. They are not tentative. They do not imply wandering or exploration. They imply being sent, being cast, being placed. The subject of the action is often not the one descending. It is the authority that sends them. This removes agency from the one who descends. They are acted upon. Return, in contrast, is almost never implied. The texts do not build anticipation of ascent. They do not describe routes back. They do not frame descent as a temporary state. Silence follows. The story moves on. The cosmos stabilizes. This pattern becomes especially important when we consider descent not into the underworld, but into distant, remote regions of the cosmos. The tablets sometimes describe beings who are sent away, not downward beneath the earth, but outward or beyond. These movements are described using similar language. Placement, assignment, fixing. What is striking is that these forms of descent are not spatially equivalent to the underworld, yet they share its finality. The direction differs, but the consequence is the same. Removal from the active system. This tells us that descent in Sumerian thought is not about direction in three-dimensional space. It is about status within the cosmic hierarchy. To descend is to be demoted in function. It is to move away from influence, not necessarily toward a specific physical location we would recognize as lower. The underworld happens to be below the earth, but it is below in authority as much as in position. Similarly, distant celestial regions that function as containment zones are below the active cosmos in terms of participation, even if they are physically above the sky. Direction, in this worldview, is symbolic of role, not altitude. This helps explain why certain descents never imply return even when they do not involve death. A god sent away is not expected to come back, because the reason for their descent has not changed. They were removed to preserve order. Their return would threaten it. The tablets do not dwell on longing for return. They do not describe suffering in terms of hope. They describe endurance, continuation, existence without participation. This is a harsher concept than annihilation, because it implies awareness without agency. When modern readers imagine ancient punishments, they often expect fire, destruction, or erasure. The Sumerian text suggests something colder: distance, isolation, permanence. A being continues to exist but outside the flow of events. This is why descent is treated with such gravity. It is not dramatic. It is administrative. It is the result of deliberation. Councils decide, decrees are issued, and then the descent occurs. After that, the narrative attention shifts elsewhere. The absence of return narratives is not a failure of imagination. It is a reflection of how final descent was meant to be. To return would undermine the authority of the decision. It would reopen what had been closed. Even in the most famous descent story where a goddess does return, the return is conditional and incomplete. A substitute must be provided. A balance must be maintained. Someone else must descend in her place. The system does not allow escape without cost. This reinforces the principle rather than contradicting it. When this framework is applied to the idea of distant celestial confinement, it becomes clear why the tablets are so restrained. A being placed beyond the sky is not expected to return. There is no reason to describe a path back. The descent has fulfilled its purpose. The phrase never implies return is not an exaggeration. It is a consistent pattern. Descent is closure. It is the end of interaction. It is the final administrative act applied to a problem that cannot be resolved through negotiation or correction. This also explains why such descents are rarely described in emotional terms. There is little outrage, little lamentation. The texts do not portray the cosmos as unjust. They portray it as orderly. What happens is what must happen. From this perspective, a planet-sized prison is not a place of torment. It is a place of resolution. It exists so that the rest of the system can function without disruption. The being placed there is not being tortured. It is being neutralized. This concept is uncomfortable for modern readers because it lacks moral drama. There is no redemption arc. There is no appeal. There is only placement. But this is precisely why it fits the Sumerian worldview so well. The universe in these texts is not concerned with individual fulfillment. It is concerned with balance. Anything that threatens balance must be addressed decisively. Descent without return is the most efficient solution. As we continue, the nature of who is subjected to this kind of descent will become clearer. It is not applied lightly. It is reserved for beings whose continued presence would destabilize the system. Their existence is tolerated. Their influence is not. The meaning of descent, then, is not travel. It is removal. It is a sentence that does not require execution. It is a judgment that does not end life, but it ends participation. And once descent has occurred in this sense, the story does not follow the one who descended. It follows the world that remains. In the Sumerian tablets, not all celestial objects are treated equally. Some are familiar, predictable, and integrated into the rhythm of daily life. Others are approached with caution, tracked carefully, and spoken of in tones that suggest unease rather than reverence. This distinction matters. It reveals that the sky was not a neutral collection of lights, but a hierarchy of presences, each carrying different implications for order, stability, and threat. The sun and the moon are described with clarity and confidence. Their movements are regular, their functions are understood, they regulate time, seasons, labour, and ritual. Their appearances are expected, their absences are alarming but temporary. These bodies are not feared, they are depended upon. They participate openly in the life of the world. The fixed stars, too, occupy a relatively stable position in Sumerian thought. They form patterns. They return to the same positions year after year. They can be named, catalogued, and associated with specific divine roles. Their predictability makes them useful. They reinforce the idea that the cosmos is ordered and intelligible, even if governed by forces beyond human control. But alongside these familiar presences are others that do not behave so neatly. Objects whose movements are irregular, lights that appear, disappear, change speed, or deviate from expected paths. These are not celebrated, they are watched. The act of watching is important. It implies vigilance rather than admiration. The tablets do not describe casual observation. They describe careful attention, repeated measurement, and the recording of anomalies. Certain celestial movements were noted precisely because they disrupted expectation. They did not fit the established pattern, and in a worldview that valued order above all else, deviation demanded explanation. Measurement follows watching. Sumerian astronomer priests did not observe the sky for curiosity alone. They observed it because the sky communicated decisions already made at higher levels of the cosmic hierarchy. A change in the heavens was not interpreted as random motion. It was read as a message, often a warning. This is why some celestial objects inspired fear. Not fear in the sense of panic or terror, but fear as disciplined respect for something that could not be controlled and whose appearance signalled potential disruption. Fear, in this context, is rational. It acknowledges risk. The tablets preserve long lists of omens associated with celestial phenomena. These lists are methodical. If a certain object appears in a certain position, then a specific consequence follows. The language is conditional, administrative, and unemotional. This reinforces the idea that fear was not chaotic. It was structured. What is notable is that not every celestial object produces omens. Only certain ones do. This selectivity suggests that some bodies were understood as passive markers, while others were active agents within the cosmic system. An active agent implies intention or function beyond mere illumination. The irregular objects occupy an uneasy category. They are not fully integrated into the predictable machinery of the heavens, but neither are they outside it. They move within boundaries, but their behaviour suggests constraint rather than freedom. They do not wander arbitrarily. They follow paths that are unusual but repeatable. This repetition allows measurement. Measurement allows anticipation. Anticipation allows fear to become manageable. Fear here does not imply that these objects were evil. The Sumerian texts do not frame the cosmos in terms of good and evil. They frame it in terms of order and disorder. A celestial object that threatens order is dangerous, regardless of moral intent. The emphasis on watching implies that these objects were not expected to interact directly with the world. Interaction would have required response. Instead, their role was indirect. They signalled. They indicated. They marked moments when something elsewhere in the system was shifting. This indirectness is crucial. It suggests that these celestial bodies were not participants in the ongoing cycles of life, but indicators of stress within the cosmic structure. Like pressure gauges on a machine, they did not cause events, but revealed that conditions had changed. Fear arises when the gauge moves into unfamiliar territory. The tablets often associate such phenomena with judgment, decree, or correction. A king might fall, a city might suffer, a harvest might fail. These consequences are not blamed on the celestial object itself. The object is not accused, it is read. This reading process reinforces the idea that the sky is an interface, not a playground. Certain elements of it reflect decisions made elsewhere. When those reflections appear, attention sharpens. Some celestial bodies are described without names, others are named but not personified. This lack of personification is significant. Gods are personified. They have attributes, stories, and relationships. A celestial object that lacks these features is not treated as a deity. It is treated as a function. A function does not require affection. It requires monitoring. The fear associated with these objects does not diminish over time. Later Mesopotamian traditions inherit and refine this vigilance. Astronomical observation becomes increasingly precise, not because fear fades, but because managing uncertainty becomes more important as civilization grows more complex. The more that depends on stability, the more dangerous disruption becomes. This helps explain why certain celestial objects are described as being held or fixed in their roles, even when their motion appears irregular. Their irregularity is not freedom, it is constraint operating under different rules. They move, but not as they wish. They move as permitted. This distinction is subtle, but it matters. An object that is free might leave. An object that is constrained remains within a defined range. The Sumerians tracked not only where these bodies went, but where they did not go. Their limits were as important as their paths. Fear arises when a boundary appears to be approached. The idea of a distant celestial body functioning as a containment zone fits naturally into this framework. Such a body would not be celebrated. It would not regulate seasons. It would not provide light or warmth. It would not bless or nurture. It would simply exist, distant and silent, yet significant enough to be acknowledged. Its movement, if any, would be watched carefully. Its position would be noted. Its relationship to other celestial elements would be measured, not because it offered benefit, but because it represented risk. The tablets suggest that some celestial objects were associated with permanence. They did not cycle. They did not mark time. They did not change meaningfully. This permanence is unsettling in a worldview built around cycles. Life depends on repetition. Agriculture depends on return. Ritual depends on recurrence. A permanent object that does not participate in cycles stands apart. It is not alive in the same way. It does not renew. It does not decay. It simply persists. Persistence without participation is another form of containment. Fear of such objects does not manifest as superstition. It manifests as careful record-keeping. The scribes did not attempt to appease these objects with offerings. They did not build temples to them. They did not pray to them for favour. They observed. Observation implies distance. You do not approach what you fear. You watch it from afar. This distance is mirrored in the language used. Descriptions are brief. They focus on position and effect, not essence. There is no attempt to explain what these objects are internally, only what they do, or what they signal. This restraint suggests that understanding was not the goal. Stability was. If a celestial object functioned as a place of confinement, this restraint would make sense. To describe its contents would invite speculation. Speculation could lead to curiosity. Curiosity could lead to transgression. The safest approach is silence. Fear, then, serves a protective role. It discourages engagement. It keeps attention focused on the functioning world rather than on what lies beyond it. The Sumerian cosmos does not encourage exploration for its own sake. It encourages maintenance. The sky is watched because it reflects the state of the system. Objects that threaten that system are feared because they represent points where control is most visible. The fact that these objects are measured implies that they are not chaotic. Chaos cannot be measured, only systems can. Only a measured object operates under rules, even if those rules differ from the familiar ones. This brings us back to the idea of containment. A prison, especially on a cosmic scale, does not need to be hidden. It needs to be stable. Its stability must be ensured. That stability can be confirmed through observation. If a distant celestial body holds something that must not return, its behaviour must be predictable enough to trust. Unpredictability would be dangerous. Measurement reduces uncertainty. Fear does not contradict trust here. It complements it. The object is trusted to perform its function, but feared because the function itself is severe. The Sumerians did not fear the cosmos as a whole. They feared specific elements within it. Those elements were not random, they were structural. As we continue, the distinction between celestial bodies that give and those that hold will become sharper. Some sustain life, others preserve order by removing threats from circulation. The tablets do not tell us what lies inside these feared objects. They tell us how they are treated. And that treatment speaks volumes. They are watched because they matter. They are measured because they must remain stable. They are feared because they represent consequences that cannot be undone. In a universe built on order rather than freedom, fear is not a weakness. It is a form of understanding. In the Sumerian tablets, naming does not imply access. This is one of the most easily overlooked features of their cosmology, and one of the most revealing. Modern readers often assume that to name a place is to make it knowable, to define it clearly enough that it can be imagined, approached, or even reached. In the Sumerian worldview, the opposite is often true. A name can function as a boundary rather than an invitation. To name a realm is not to open it, but to fix it in place within the cosmic order. This distinction becomes especially important when we encounter realms that are named carefully, sometimes repeatedly, yet never described as destinations. They are acknowledged, referenced, and located within the structure of the universe, but no journey leads to them. No hero travels there. No god visits casually. No return path is described. These places exist, but they are not meant to be entered. The act of naming, for the Sumerians, was an exercise of authority. Names were not labels applied arbitrarily. They defined function, role, and position. To name something was to establish what it was for. how it related to other elements of the cosmos and what rules governed it. A named realm was therefore not undefined or mysterious in a careless sense. It was defined precisely enough that its purpose was understood even if its contents were not. This is why some realms receive names but no narratives. Their role is administrative, not experiential. They exist to serve the system, not to be explored within it. The underworld is an instructive comparison. It is named, it is described, it is feared. It is also travelled to, but only under extreme conditions and always with consequence. Even then, the journeys are limited, ritualised and costly. The underworld allows entry because it is designed to receive a continuous flow. Death is universal. The system must accommodate it. Travel there, while dangerous, is structurally necessary. Other realms are not like this. They are not part of a cycle. They are endpoints. The tablets sometimes refer to distant regions associated with judgment, confinement, or removal. These regions have names, but those names function more like filing categories than place names in the modern sense. They identify where something belongs once a decision has been made. They do not suggest that movement to and from these realms is expected or even possible. This becomes clear when we examine the verbs associated with these realms. Beings are sent there, they are assigned there, they are placed there. They are not said to arrive by choice. They do not set out on journeys. The realm does not call to them. Authority directs them. Travel, in the Sumerian text, is almost always purposeful and constrained. Merchants travel between cities. Gods travel to attend councils. Messengers move between realms. Travel implies exchange, communication, or negotiation. The realms that are named but never travelled to do not participate in any of these processes. There is nothing to exchange, nothing to negotiate, nothing to retrieve. The absence of travel narratives is not accidental. The Sumerians were storytellers. They preserved long, detailed journeys when they mattered. They described routes, obstacles, rituals, and encounters. When none of this appears, it is because the concept itself is inappropriate. Travel to these realms would contradict their function. This is why curiosity about these places is muted in the texts. The scribes do not speculate. They do not imagine what life is like there. They do not populate these realms with vivid imagery. To do so would be to invite engagement. Engagement would imply permeability. Permeability would undermine containment. A named realm that is never travelled to is, by definition, closed. Closure does not require ignorance. It requires recognition. The Sumerians knew these realms existed. They knew where they fit in the cosmic structure. They knew what happened when something was sent there. That knowledge was sufficient. Further detail was unnecessary and potentially dangerous. This restraint reflects a broader principle in Sumerian thought. Knowledge is not always beneficial. Some knowledge destabilizes. Some understanding invites transgression. The gods themselves restrict information. Tablets describe warnings, prohibitions, and silences. Certain names are spoken carefully. Certain actions are forbidden. When a realm is named but never travelled to, it signals a place where knowledge stops being useful. Knowing more would not improve life or order. It would only introduce uncertainty. This principle applies equally to divine beings. Gods are not omniscient in the Sumerian worldview. They operate within domains. They have authority, but also limitations. Some realms lie outside their normal jurisdiction. When a god is assigned to such a realm as punishment, it is not treated as an adventure or a challenge. It is treated as removal from participation in the shared system. The permanence of such assignments is emphasized by the lack of return stories. The texts do not describe parole. They do not hint at rehabilitation. Once placed, the being remains. This is not because the Sumerians lacked imagination. It is because their concept of justice prioritized stability over transformation. A being that threatens balance is not reformed. It is neutralized. The naming of these realms serves an important social function as well. It reassures those within the system that there are mechanisms for dealing with threats that do not involve constant conflict. Not every problem must be fought. Some are simply relocated beyond reach. This idea would have resonated deeply with a society that valued order, hierarchy, and predictability. Cities depended on stable irrigation. Temples depended on regular offerings. Kings depended on legitimacy. Chaos was not romantic. It was catastrophic. A cosmos that includes places specifically designed to hold chaos at a distance is therefore comforting, not frightening. The fact that these realms are never travelled to reinforces their reliability. If no one goes there, no one brings anything back. There is no contamination. No influence leaks back into the active world. The boundary holds. The language used to describe these realms often emphasises distance without measurement. They are far, but not in miles or days of travel. They are far in terms of access. Distance here is not physical alone, it is functional. A realm can be close in space and still be unreachable if the rules forbid passage. This distinction is crucial. Modern readers often imagine ancient people thinking in purely physical terms. The Sumerians thought structurally. A place's importance lay in its role, not its coordinates. A planet-sized prison, understood in this framework, would not need to be described as such. It would be named, its function would be implied, its inaccessibility would be assumed. No story would involve travelling there because travel would violate its purpose. The silence around such a realm would be intentional. It would discourage speculation. It would prevent myths of escape. It would reinforce the finality of placement. Naming without travel also serves to legitimize authority. If a realm exists where offenders can be placed permanently, authority does not need to constantly reassert itself through violence. The threat of removal is enough. The knowledge that such places exist is sufficient. This logic appears repeatedly in administrative texts as well as mythological ones. Penalties are assigned, fates are fixed, outcomes are recorded. The process matters more than the drama. The Sumerians were not interested in redemption narratives in the modern sense. They were interested in balance. Once balance was restored, attention shifted away from the cause of disruption. A realm that is named but never travelled to represents the endpoint of attention. Once something is placed there, it no longer matters in the same way. The world continues. This does not mean these realms were ignored. They were acknowledged precisely because acknowledgement reinforces closure. To forget a realm would be to invite uncertainty. To name it and then never approach it is to lock it firmly into place. As we continue moving through the tablets, the pattern becomes clearer. Certain locations are central, vibrant, and described in rich detail. Others are peripheral, silent, and fixed. The difference is not accidental. It reflects their role in the cosmic system. The Sumerian universe is not a landscape to be explored. It is a structure to be maintained. Some rooms are lived in, others are sealed. A sealed room still exists. It still has a name. But no one opens the door. This is why the idea of a distant, isolated realm functioning as permanent containment fits so seamlessly into the Sumerian worldview. Such a place would be known, acknowledged, and avoided. Its existence would be accepted without curiosity. Its purpose would be understood without explanation. The fact that it is never travelled to is not a gap in the record. It is the point. As we move forward, the implications of this restraint will become more evident. The Sumerians did not need to imagine escape from every boundary. They built a cosmos where some boundaries were meant to remain closed forever, and in that cosmos, a named realm that no one journeys to is not a mystery. It is a solution. In the Sumerian tablets, distance is not measured in steps, days, or visible horizons. It is expressed through language choices that signal separation without ever quantifying it. Words that suggest far, removed, beyond, and apart appear repeatedly, but they are rarely anchored to physical travel. Distance in this context is not about how long it takes to reach a place. It is about whether reaching it is permitted at all. This distinction is subtle, but once noticed, it reshapes how the texts must be read. When a place is described as distant, the scribes are not inviting the reader to imagine a journey. They are signalling disconnection. The distance is functional rather than geographical. It describes a break in interaction, not a gap in space. Silence works the same way. The absence of description is not a failure of record keeping. It is deliberate restraint. The Sumerians were meticulous writers. They recorded economic transactions, ritual formulas, hymns, debates, myths, omens, and genealogies with remarkable detail. When they chose not to describe something, that choice carried meaning. Silence in these texts is not emptiness, it is closure. Certain realms, beings, and outcomes are surrounded by a quiet that feels intentional. The scribes mention them briefly, then move on. No elaboration follows, no metaphor expands them, no narrative returns to them. This silence is not accidental loss. It is preserved across multiple tablets copied by generations of scribes who chose to maintain it. This persistence tells us that silence was part of the message. Prohibition completes this triad, where distance establishes separation and silence limits imagination. Prohibition enforces compliance. The tablets do not rely on moral persuasion to discourage transgression. They rely on clear boundaries. Certain actions are forbidden. Certain names are restricted. Certain knowledge is withheld. Prohibition is rarely explained. It does not need justification. Authority speaks, and that is enough. When these three elements appear together, distance, silence, and prohibition, they mark something that exists within the cosmic system but outside acceptable engagement. The combination is unmistakable. The place or concept is acknowledged, but it is also fenced off linguistically and culturally. This pattern appears in descriptions of divine secrets. Certain rituals are reserved for specific priests. Certain names of gods are spoken only in specific contexts. Certain knowledge is transmitted carefully, often with warnings. The goal is not to enlighten everyone. It is to preserve order. Applied to cosmic realms, this pattern becomes even more significant. When a distant place is named but never described, when no journey leads there, and when language around it remains restrained, the implication is not ignorance, it is intentional exclusion. The scribes did not lack curiosity. They lacked permission. Distance is reinforced through repetition. A place described once as far might be poetic. A place described repeatedly as distant, removed, and unreachable becomes structurally separated. Over time, the reader learns not to expect further information. The mind is trained to stop. Silence reinforces this training. The absence of narrative builds a kind of cognitive boundary. Readers are not invited to imagine life there. They are not encouraged to speculate. The text offers no footholds for imagination. Prohibition seals it. Even when curiosity arises, the framework of the culture discourages pursuit. Some questions are not meant to be asked. Some places are not meant to be considered beyond their function. This is not censorship in the modern sense. It is prioritization. The Sumerians believed that knowledge had weight. Some knowledge stabilized the world. Other knowledge threatened it. The role of the scribe was not to reveal everything, but to preserve what mattered. The language of distance appears most clearly in phrases that imply removal without relocation. Beings are sent away, but not said to arrive. They are placed, but not said to dwell. The grammar itself resists habitation. These places are not homes, they are endpoints. Silence then removes temptation. Without stories, there is nothing to empathize with. Without imagery, there is nothing to visualize. The place remains abstract enough to avoid emotional engagement, yet concrete enough to serve its function. Prohibition ensures compliance by making engagement unnecessary. The reason does not matter. The rule does. This linguistic strategy appears again and again when the tablets address matters of cosmic discipline. Punishments are recorded without drama. Outcomes are stated without elaboration. The emphasis is on finality, not suffering. This restraint can feel cold to modern readers, but it reflects a worldview that valued stability over expression. The cosmos was not a story to be enjoyed. It was a system to be maintained. The combination of distance, silence, and prohibition creates a powerful psychological effect. It discourages curiosity not by force, but by absence. The mind naturally turns toward what is described richly and away from what remains closed. This is why the Sumerians could acknowledge the existence of dangerous or final realms without needing to mythologize them extensively. The less said, the better. When applied to the idea of a cosmic containment zone, this strategy makes perfect sense. A place designed to hold what must not return would benefit from exactly this treatment. Describe it too much, and it becomes familiar. Make it familiar, and someone will imagine escape. The tablets do not indulge such imagination. Distance ensures that the place feels removed from daily life. Silence ensures that it remains undefined. Prohibition ensures that it is not approached, even conceptually. Together, these elements form a linguistic barrier as effective as any wall. This also explains why later traditions, when they inherit fragments of these ideas, often reshape them into more vivid narratives. Later cultures were more comfortable with moral drama, redemption, and transformation. They filled in the silences with stories. The earlier Sumerian texts did not. They left the silences intact. This preservation suggests that the silences served a purpose beyond storytelling. They enforced a way of thinking about the universe. Some things exist so that everything else can continue safely. They do not require attention. They require distance. The language of prohibition often appears indirectly. Instead of stating outright that something must not be done, the texts simply do not show it being done. Absence becomes instruction. If no one travels there, the reader understands that travel is not an option. This method is subtle and effective. It teaches through pattern rather than command. Distance, likewise, is reinforced through lack of measurement. A journey described without time or steps cannot be replicated. It cannot be imagined practically. It remains symbolic of separation rather than movement. Silence completes the effect by denying emotional hooks. There is no suffering described, no longing, no rebellion. The being or thing placed beyond the boundary simply ceases to matter within the narrative. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Sumerian worldview. Not that punishment exists, but that it is treated as routine. The cosmos absorbs disruption and moves on. The absence of pity in these descriptions is not cruelty. It is prioritization. The well-being of the system outweighs the experience of the individual. From this perspective, a planet-sized prison is not a dramatic invention. It is an administrative necessity. A place where distance removes influence, silence prevents fixation, and prohibition ensures permanence. The language used around such a place would need to do exactly what the tablets do. Acknowledge without elaborating, name without narrating, indicate without inviting. The Sumerians achieved this through consistent linguistic discipline. Over centuries of copying and transmission, the pattern remained intact. That consistency is itself evidence of intent. As we continue, the consequences of this linguistic strategy will become clearer. The more we examine who is subject to distance, silence, and prohibition, the more apparent it becomes that these tools are reserved for the most serious threats to order. The cosmos does not argue with such threats. It removes them, and once removed, the language itself ensures that they remain where they belong, far enough away, quiet enough, and forbidden enough that the world below can continue without disturbance. In the Sumerian tablets, giving and receiving are never neutral actions. Exchange defines participation in the living world. The earth gives crops and receives labour. Temples receive offerings and give protection. Gods receive worship and give order, judgment, or favour. Even the underworld, bleak as it is, participates in a form of exchange. The dead arrive, and in return, the balance of life is maintained. Nothing exists entirely outside this system of reciprocity, except one category of place, a place that receives but never gives back. This distinction is subtle, yet once recognised, it becomes impossible to ignore. The tablets repeatedly describe destinations where beings are sent, placed, or assigned, yet no influence ever flows outward from them. No omens originate there. No blessings emerge. No messengers arrive from within. These places absorb presence and then fall silent. In a cosmology where interaction defines reality, silence of this kind signals a deliberate function. The idea of a planet that receives but does not give back fits this pattern precisely. It would not act. It would not intervene. It would not communicate. Its role would be passive, but not empty. Passivity here is not absence. It is containment. The Sumerians did not conceive of existence as a series of isolated locations. Everything meaningful was part of a network of cause and response. The sun rises and crops grow. A king rules and order follows. A god decrees and fate unfolds. Even punishment has consequences that ripple outward. Famine alters cities. Flood reshapes land. War reorders boundaries. These events give back to the system, often violently, but they give. A place that does not give back breaks this pattern. It removes something from circulation without producing a compensating effect. This is not imbalance, it is resolution. When the tablets describe certain removals, they emphasize finality. The narrative does not track the removed being's condition. It does not describe suffering or adaptation. It does not imagine rebellion or escape. The removal itself is the point. Once completed, the story returns to the functioning world. This is fundamentally different from exile. Exile implies distance but preserves connection. An exile may return. An exile may influence events from afar. An exile remains part of the system, even if marginally. The places described in the tablets that receive but do not give back are not places of exile. They are places of exclusion. Exclusion does not require annihilation. In fact, annihilation removes too much. It erases memory, lineage, and consequence. The Sumerian worldview often prefers preservation over erasure. Memory matters, records matter. The continued existence of what has been removed serves as a reminder of authority and consequence, even if that existence no longer affects daily life. This helps explain why the tablets are comfortable with the idea of eternal placement. A being can exist forever and still be irrelevant to the functioning world. Eternity, in this sense, is not a reward. It is neutralization. A planet-sized containment zone would function perfectly within this logic. It would be large enough to hold what cannot be destroyed. It would be distant enough to prevent interference, and most importantly, it would be silent. Nothing would return from it. The silence is crucial. In Mesopotamian cosmology, speech is power. Decrees shape reality. Names establish roles. Words create order. A place that does not speak does not participate. A place that does not send signs does not influence fate. Silence is not merely absence of sound. It is absence of agency. When celestial bodies are associated with omens, they give back information. Their movements are read. Their appearances signal change. They participate in governance indirectly. A body that does not produce omens does not govern. It does not advise. It does not warn. It exists outside the administrative flow. The tablets imply that such places exist, but they do not dwell on them. The scribes do not ask what happens inside. They do not describe internal processes. To do so would imply relevance. Relevance would undermine the function. Receiving without giving back is the most absolute form of control, Once something is placed there, it is finished as a factor. The cosmos does not need to manage it further. The system stabilizes. This also explains why these places are never associated with cult, worship or ritual. There are no offerings made to them, no hymns address them, no festivals mark their cycles. They have no cycles. They do not require appeasement because they do not act. The absence of ritual engagement is one of the strongest indicators of function. The Sumerians ritualized almost everything that mattered. If a place mattered in an active sense, it would have attracted ritual attention. The lack of such attention is deliberate. The underworld again provides a useful contrast. It is bleak, but it is active. Judges speak. Gates open and close. Rituals for the dead matter. Offerings are made. The underworld gives back in the form of cosmic balance. It is part of the system. A place that receives but does not give back is something else entirely. It is not a realm of judgment in progress. Judgment has already been completed. The sentence has been carried out. What remains is storage. Storage is not a concept modern readers often associate with ancient cosmology, but it appears repeatedly in administrative texts. Goods are stored, tablets are archived, records are sealed. What is stored is preserved but inactive. It exists, but it does not circulate. A planet-sized prison would be cosmic storage. The language used in the tablets around such concepts is often technical rather than emotional. There is no emphasis on pain or suffering. There is emphasis on placement, duration and permanence. This again points to administrative thinking rather than moral drama. It is tempting to imagine that a place that never gives back must be empty or lifeless. The Sumerian texts do not support this assumption. They never equate silence with emptiness. The primordial waters were silent yet full. The deep beneath the earth is quiet yet inhabited. Silence does not mean nothingness. It means withdrawal from interaction. This distinction matters because it prevents us from dismissing these places as symbolic abstractions. They are treated as real, functional components of the cosmos. They have roles, even if those roles are defined by absence. The idea of receiving without giving back also appears in the language of fate. Once a fate is fixed, it does not negotiate. It does not explain itself. It does not respond to pleading. It simply unfolds. Fate receives actions and produces outcomes, but once a final outcome is reached, there is no reversal. A containment realm operates similarly. It receives a being, and that reception completes the process. There is no further narrative obligation. This framework also helps explain why the tablets avoid describing attempts to escape such realms. Escape would imply that the place gives back influence. It would reintroduce uncertainty. The Sumerians were deeply uncomfortable with unresolved uncertainty at the cosmic level. Their myths often explore conflict, but they resolve it decisively. Councils decide. Decrees are issued. Balance is restored. The story moves on. Loose ends are rare. A place that receives but does not give back is the ultimate loose end management tool. When later traditions reinterpret these ideas, they often introduce moral complexity, rebellion, and return. These are later developments. The earliest layers are more austere. They prioritize function over narrative satisfaction. This austerity can feel unsettling. It suggests a universe that does not care about individual redemption. But that interpretation misunderstands the priority. The universe, as imagined by the Sumerians, cares about continuity. Individuals matter only insofar as they affect the system. A being powerful enough to threaten that continuity cannot be allowed to circulate. But destroying such a being might have unpredictable consequences. Containment avoids that risk. This is where the scale of a planet becomes relevant. A city prison holds humans. A cosmic prison must hold gods or forces that operate on a larger scale. Size here is not about punishment. It is about capacity. The tablets never describe such a place in detail, because detail would anthropomorphize it. It would turn containment into narrative. Narrative invites sympathy. Sympathy invites curiosity. Curiosity invites transgression. Instead, the place remains functional and mute. The idea that a planet exists solely to receive and never give back challenges modern assumptions about celestial bodies. We tend to imagine planets as worlds, as places of potential life or exploration. The Sumerians did not think this way. A celestial body could have a role entirely unrelated to habitation. Its significance would lie not in what lives on it, but in what is placed there. The lack of descriptive imagery reinforces this. The tablets do not describe landscapes, climates, or inhabitants. They describe outcomes. Someone is sent. Something is placed. The result is stability. This also explains why such a place would be feared indirectly. Fear does not arise from its activity, but from what it represents. It is the destination of final decisions. It is where problems go to disappear from relevance. No one prays to such a place. No one seeks favour from it. No one imagines living there. Its existence is acknowledged with restraint. In this sense, the planet that receives but does not give back is not hostile. It is indifferent. Indifference is more powerful than hostility, because it does not respond. The Sumerians understood this intuitively. They lived in a world where indifference, drought, flood and famine could devastate entire regions without malice. Indifference was not comforting, but it was real. A cosmic structure that includes a place of pure indifference toward what it contains is consistent with that experience. As this exploration continues, the implications of such a place will deepen. We will see how judgment without death functions, how eternal isolation replaces execution, and why the tablets avoid describing life inside such realms. For now, what matters is recognizing the pattern. The Sumerian cosmos includes places that give and receive, places that exchange and interact, and places that only receive. Once something enters the last category, it ceases to matter in the ongoing story of the world. That silence is not neglect, it is design. And in a universe built on design rather than chance, a place that receives and does not give back is not an anomaly. It is an essential component of order. In the Sumerian tablets, being sent away is not treated as an emotional act. It is not exile in the sense of shame, anger, or rejection. The language is colder, more deliberate. Those who are removed are not cast out in fury. They are placed. Placement implies intention. It implies planning. It implies that the destination itself already exists for this purpose. This distinction matters because banishment suggests improvisation. A ruler banishes when a problem becomes intolerable and no better solution is available. Placement suggests something else entirely. It suggests that the system already anticipated this outcome. The destination is not created in response to the offence. It is already there, waiting. The Sumerians understood authority as structural rather than reactive. Kings ruled because kingship had descended from heaven. Gods governed because domains had been assigned at the beginning of time. Order existed before individual actions occurred. When a being disrupted that order, the response did not require invention. It required execution of an existing rule. This is why the tablets avoid language that frames removal as emotional rejection. There is no emphasis on humiliation. There is no language of disgrace. There is no sense that the removed being has been pushed out into uncertainty. Instead, the texts emphasize certainty. The being is sent to a specific place. The decision is final. The system moves on. Placement also implies suitability. The destination is not arbitrary. It matches the nature of the being removed. This is crucial. The Sumerians did not believe that punishment should be symbolic alone. It should be functional. A being is placed where it can no longer interfere, but where its existence does not destabilize the larger order. This logic appears clearly in how the tablets describe divine conflict. When gods disagree, the outcome is not always violence. It is often reassignment. Authority is redistributed. Domains are adjusted. One god may lose influence while another gains it. These changes are administrative, not moral. Only when a being fundamentally threatens the structure itself does removal occur. Even then, destruction is not the default response. The Sumerians were cautious about erasing powerful beings. Erasure creates uncertainty. What is destroyed might return in another form. What is removed and placed is controlled. This is why the language of placement is so precise. Verbs meaning to fix, to set, to assign, and to station appear repeatedly. These words carry weight. They imply permanence. A thing that is fixed does not wander. A thing that is stationed does not roam. A thing that is assigned has a role, even if that role is inactivity. This applies to gods as well as to humans. The tablets make it clear that divine beings are not beyond consequence. They can be restrained. They can be limited. They can be removed from active participation. What they cannot be is uncontrolled. The idea that a god could be placed somewhere and left there indefinitely without being destroyed challenges modern assumptions about ancient religion. Many people imagine ancient gods as either omnipotent or purely symbolic. The Sumerian gods are neither. They are powerful but bounded. They are eternal but governed. This governance requires mechanisms. Placement is one of them. When we examine cases where beings are sent away in the texts, a pattern emerges. The destination is rarely described in terms of suffering. The emphasis is not on pain. It is on absence. The being no longer appears. It no longer acts. Its name may still be known, but its influence has ended. This absence is the punishment. In this framework, banishment would be insufficient. A banished being might act from afar. It might gather allies. It might return unexpectedly. Placement prevents all of this. Placement isolates completely. This is why the Sumerians do not describe these destinations as wilderness or chaos. Chaos is unpredictable. A wilderness invites survival. A wilderness allows adaptation. A place of placement must be stable, closed, and unchanging. A planet-sized containment zone fits these requirements perfectly. It is distant enough to prevent interaction. It is large enough to hold beings of immense power. It is fixed in the cosmic structure. It does not need guards. It does not need constant enforcement. Its isolation is sufficient. The tablets do not explicitly name such a place as a prison, because the concept of prison, as we understand it, is tied to social shame and reform. The Sumerian concept is closer to storage or sequestration. Something dangerous is removed from circulation and placed where it cannot cause harm. This does not require cruelty. It requires authority. The beings who are placed are not always villains in the moral sense. They may simply be incompatible with the current order. Their continued presence would destabilize the system. That is enough. This perspective explains why the tablets do not linger on the emotional state of those who are removed. Emotion is irrelevant. What matters is outcome. When modern readers encounter silence around the fate of removed beings, they often assume loss of text or lack of interest. But the consistency of this silence suggests design. The scribes knew what they were doing. They chose not to follow these beings because following them would imply continued relevance. Placement ends relevance. This is also why such beings are rarely mourned. Mourning implies loss to the community. But removal of a destabilizing force is not loss, it is restoration. The Sumerian worldview was not centered on individual experience, it was centered on collective stability. Cities mattered more than individuals. Irrigation mattered more than personal freedom. Cosmic balance mattered more than personal justice. This does not mean the Sumerians were cruel, it means their priorities were different. In a world where floods could wipe out entire regions, where drought could starve thousands, where disorder meant death on a massive scale, stability was the highest good. Anything that threatened it had to be addressed decisively. Placement is decisive without being destructive. The difference between banishment and placement becomes especially clear when we consider duration. Banishment is often temporary. Placement is indefinite. The tablets do not speak of terms or sentences. There is no countdown. There is no expectation of release. Indefinite duration is not emphasized because it is assumed. This assumption tells us that the place itself is permanent. A temporary place would require ongoing management. A permanent place does not. The Sumerians were builders. They constructed cities meant to last generations. They dug canals that reshaped landscapes. They recorded laws meant to endure. Their cosmic thinking reflects the same mindset. Structures are built to last. A cosmic containment zone would be one of the most important structures of all. It would not be improvised. It would be foundational. This also explains why such a place would not be integrated into mythic storytelling. Myths explore conflict, resolution, and meaning. Placement removes conflict. It ends the story. There is nothing to narrate afterward. When later cultures inherited fragments of these ideas, they often reintroduced narrative drama. They imagined rebellion, suffering, escape, and return. These are compelling stories. They are also fundamentally different from the Sumerian approach. The earliest texts are austere. They are procedural. They describe what happens, not how it feels. Those who are sent away are not villains cast into darkness. They are elements removed from a system that cannot accommodate them. This reframing changes how we should read references to distant, silent realms. These are not mythic hells. They are not places of torment. They are places of exclusion. Exclusion is more effective than punishment in a system designed for continuity. The idea that a being could exist forever in isolation without affecting the world is unsettling to modern sensibilities. We tend to associate existence with interaction. The Sumerians did not. Existence without participation was entirely conceivable. The underworld itself demonstrates this. The dead exist, but they do not shape events. They do not influence harvests or kingship. They do not intervene. They persist, but they are irrelevant to the functioning world. A cosmic placement zone would operate on the same principle, but at a higher level. The beings placed there are not dead. They are inactive. This inactivity is enforced not through chains or suffering, but through distance and closure. The being remains where it is because the structure of the cosmos does not allow movement. The lack of description about life in such places reinforces this. Life implies process. Process implies change. Change implies potential disruption. The tablets avoid all of this. They tell us who is placed, not what happens afterward. This is not oversight. It is instruction. The Sumerian scribes were teaching future generations how the cosmos works. They were not entertaining them. The lesson is clear. Some problems are not solved. They are contained. Those who are sent away are not erased from existence. They are erased from relevance. This is a far more complete solution than banishment. Banishment leaves open the possibility of return. Placement closes it. As we continue, we will see how this logic applies to judgment that does not end in death, to isolation that replaces execution, and to silence that becomes the final expression of authority. For now, what matters is recognizing the precision of the language. The tablets do not say these beings flee. They do not say they escape. They do not say they wander. They are sent. They are placed. And once placed, the world no longer needs to speak of them. That quiet is not mercy. It is order. In the Sumerian tablets, judgment is not synonymous with execution. This is one of the most difficult ideas for modern readers to absorb, because it runs against deeply ingrained assumptions about punishment and resolution. In many later traditions, judgment culminates in death, destruction, or erasure. A wrong is committed, a sentence is passed, and existence ends. The Sumerian worldview, especially in its earliest layers, approaches judgment differently. Death is not the ultimate tool. It is often an insufficient one. To understand this, it is necessary to separate judgment from vengeance. The Sumerians were not interested in punishment as emotional release. Their gods do not lash out simply to express anger. Even when rage appears in the texts, it is followed by procedure. Councils convene, decrees are issued, outcomes are structured. The goal is not satisfaction, the goal is stability. Death, in this system, is blunt. It removes a being entirely, along with any memory, consequence or lesson associated with that being. For ordinary humans, death is unavoidable, and therefore not a meaningful punishment. It happens regardless of behaviour. For gods or semi-divine beings, death is often temporary, reversible, or conceptually incoherent. Many divine beings cannot truly die in the way humans do. Killing them solves nothing. This is why judgment that does not end in death becomes necessary. The tablets show repeatedly that existence can continue under severe limitation. A being can live and yet be powerless. It can persist and yet be irrelevant. This is not a failure of justice, it is its completion. The removal of influence matters more than the removal of life. The underworld provides a clear example. Humans who die do not cease to exist. They enter a realm of shadow and stillness. They eat dust. They drink stagnant water. They remember life but do not participate in it. This is not described as punishment for wrongdoing. It is simply the condition of death. But it demonstrates a crucial principle. Existence can continue without agency. The same principle is applied selectively to judgment. When the tablets describe divine judgment, they do not always describe killing. They describe binding, assigning, fixing, and placing. These verbs appear again and again. They indicate restriction rather than termination. The being judged is still there, but its capacity to act has been neutralized. This approach reflects a profound concern with unintended consequences. The Sumerians lived in a world where actions often produced cascading effects. A flood destroyed fields, but also altered trade. A war killed soldiers but destabilized irrigation. Removing a powerful being entirely could have unpredictable results. Containment avoids this risk. Judgment without death preserves structure. The texts also suggest that some beings possess knowledge or essence that cannot be destroyed without damaging the cosmic order itself. Knowledge, in the Sumerian worldview, is dangerous but necessary. The gods themselves are not free from this danger. Enki's wisdom saves humanity repeatedly, but it also disrupts divine decisions. His knowledge cannot be erased, it can only be managed. When knowledge becomes a threat, the solution is not elimination. It is isolation. This is why certain judgments result in eternal separation rather than death. The being continues to exist, carrying whatever essence or knowledge it possesses, but that essence no longer circulates. It does not influence events. It does not alter outcomes. It remains contained. The absence of death in these judgments is not mercy. It is control. The Sumerians did not romanticize death. They feared it, but they did not imbue it with redemptive meaning. Death was final for humans in terms of participation, but it was not morally corrective. A dead person did not become better. They became silent. Silence alone does not restore balance if the imbalance was structural. Judgment aims at balance, not morality. This is why the tablets often describe judgments in administrative language. Fates are decreed. Destinies are fixed. These are not emotional acts. They are procedural. Once enacted, they do not require revisiting. A being judged in this way does not suffer publicly. There is no spectacle. There is no warning narrative meant to inspire fear through horror. Fear is implicit in the finality of the outcome. To be removed from participation forever is a severe sentence in a culture that defined existence through role and function. The lack of descriptive suffering is intentional. Suffering is transient. Placement is permanent. Judgment that does not end in death also avoids martyrdom. A destroyed being might be remembered, mourned, or idealized. A placed being fades from relevance. Its name may remain in lists, but its story ends. This quiet ending reinforces authority more effectively than dramatic destruction. It teaches that opposition leads not to glorious downfall, but to irrelevance. The tablets reflect this consistently. When beings are judged, the narrative rarely follows them. It follows the restored order. Fields are replanted, cities function, the cosmos resumes its rhythm. The judged being is no longer a factor. This absence is more instructive than any moral speech. The concept of eternal judgment without death also aligns with how the Sumerians understood time. Time was cyclical, but not infinitely forgiving. Cycles repeat, but they do not reset everything. Some changes persist. Once a decree is issued, it becomes part of the structure. A being placed under eternal judgment does not wait for a future cycle to bring release. Cycles govern seasons, not sentences. This permanence contrasts sharply with later traditions that introduce ideas of redemption, repentance, or eventual restoration. The Sumerian cosmos is not interested in rehabilitation. It is interested in continuity. Continuity requires that certain disruptions never re-enter the system. Judgment without death ensures this by creating a category of existence that is functionally inert. The being exists, but nothing flows from that existence back into the world. This also explains why the tablets are careful not to frame such judgments as unjust. Justice, in the Sumerian sense, is not fairness to individuals. It is correctness of structure. If the structure functions, justice has been served. This perspective is difficult for modern sensibilities, which often prioritize individual experience and moral accounting. The Sumerian worldview prioritizes survival at scale. Cities, rivers, and cosmic stability matter more than any single being's fate. Judgment is therefore evaluated by outcome, not intent. A planet-sized containment zone becomes intelligible within this framework. Such a place allows judgment to be enacted without the risk of destruction. It holds what must not circulate. It preserves existence while eliminating influence. The scale matters. Human prisons hold humans. Cosmic containment must hold beings of cosmic consequence. The Sumerians did not think in metaphors when it came to administration. Size matched function. This is why the tablets do not present death as the ultimate threat for gods. The ultimate threat is removal from relevance. To be alive and yet unable to act is the harshest sentence imaginable in a system where power defines identity. Judgment that does not end in death also avoids the problem of resurrection. Many gods die and return in Sumerian myth. Death is not always permanent, placement is. This distinction is critical. If death can be reversed, it cannot serve as a final judgment. Placement cannot be reversed without deliberate intervention, and the texts show that such intervention is rare and destabilizing. The cosmos prefers solutions that do not require ongoing correction. This also sheds light on why the tablets are restrained when describing such judgments. Excessive detail would invite empathy. Empathy might lead to questioning. Questioning might undermine acceptance of the system. Instead, the texts present judgment as fact. It happens, it works, the world continues. The beings subjected to such judgment are not portrayed as screaming, resisting, or pleading. They are not protagonists, they are problems resolved. This does not mean the Sumerians lacked compassion. It means compassion was not the organizing principle of their cosmology. Order was. In a world constantly threatened by natural forces beyond human control, order was sacred. Anything that threatened it had to be addressed decisively. Judgment without death achieves this decisiveness. It removes the threat permanently without tearing holes in the fabric of existence. It allows the cosmos to remain intact. The silence surrounding such judgments reinforces their finality. Once enacted, they are not discussed again. Discussion implies uncertainty. Uncertainty threatens stability. The Sumerians were comfortable with silence where final decisions were concerned. As we move forward, this understanding will be essential. The next stages will explore how eternal isolation functions as punishment, how memory is preserved without influence, and why the tablets avoid describing life inside places of containment. For now, what matters is recognizing that judgment in the Sumerian worldview is not about ending existence. It is about ending participation. Death removes life, judgment removes relevance, and in a cosmos built on role, function, and order, relevance is everything. Once it is taken away, nothing further is required. The sentence has been carried out, not with violence, but with permanence, and the universe, relieved of disruption, continues as if nothing had happened. In the Sumerian understanding of the cosmos, isolation is not a failure of order. It is one of its most essential tools. Eternal isolation does not appear as cruelty or excess. It appears as maintenance. The universe, as described in the tablets, is not self-correcting. It does not heal disruptions automatically. It requires intervention, regulation, and, when necessary, permanent separation. To modern minds, isolation often feels temporary by definition. We imagine solitude as something endured until circumstances change. The Sumerians did not share this assumption. Isolation, in their worldview, could be final without being destructive. A being could exist forever and yet be removed entirely from influence. That condition was not tragic from the perspective of divine order. It was ideal. The divine order described in the tablets is not moral in the way later religious systems would become. It is procedural. Each god, force, and realm has a role. Harmony exists when those roles are fulfilled without interference. Disruption occurs when something exceeds its assigned function, crosses boundaries, or accumulates influence it was never meant to hold. When such disruption cannot be corrected through reassignment or limitation, isolation becomes necessary. Isolation solves a specific problem that no other solution can address. It preserves existence while eliminating interaction. It removes influence without creating absence. Absence creates instability. Isolation creates stillness. Stillness is valuable. The Sumerians lived in an environment where stillness was rare and precious. Floodwaters destroyed fields. Winds reshaped dunes. Rivers changed course. Even cities required constant maintenance to survive. Against this backdrop, the idea of something rendered permanently still was not frightening. It was reassuring. In the divine order, stillness equals control. Eternal isolation functions as a kind of cosmic pause button. Whatever is isolated no longer participates in cycles of cause and effect. It does not provoke reaction. It does not respond to stimulus. It simply exists, fixed in place, unable to disturb the system. This is why eternal isolation is not applied casually. It is reserved for situations where no adjustment short of total removal will suffice. The tablets imply that the divine assembly does not rush to this outcome. Decisions are weighed, alternatives are attempted. Only when a being or force proves fundamentally incompatible with ongoing order does isolation occur. Compatibility is the key concept here. The Sumerian cosmos does not punish difference. It punishes incompatibility. A god may be violent, jealous, or erratic, and still remain within the system if their behavior can be absorbed. What cannot be absorbed must be isolated. This framework explains why eternal isolation is not described emotionally. Emotion implies relationship. Relationship implies interaction. Interaction is precisely what isolation is meant to prevent. The texts do not ask whether isolation is fair. Fairness is not the metric. The question is whether the system continues to function. When a being is isolated eternally, the divine order benefits in several ways. First, the threat is neutralized permanently. There is no risk of return, rebellion, or influence from afar. Second, the being's existence continues, avoiding the unpredictable consequences of destruction. Third, the decision requires no ongoing enforcement. Once isolation is established, the cosmos does not need to revisit it. This efficiency matters. The Sumerian gods are not omnipotent in the abstract sense. They govern, but they also manage limited resources. Attention, intervention, and enforcement require effort. A solution that resolves a problem permanently without continued oversight is superior to one that demands constant vigilance. Eternal isolation is such a solution. It is important to understand that isolation in this context does not imply loneliness as humans experience it. The tablets are not concerned with subjective suffering. They are concerned with objective function. A being isolated eternally may be aware or unaware, conscious or inert. The texts do not specify, because it does not matter. What matters is that the being no longer interacts with the system. Interaction is the currency of relevance. Divine order depends on predictable interaction. The sun rises, the moon cycles, the rivers flood, kings rule, gods decree. When interaction becomes unpredictable, order collapses. Eternal isolation removes unpredictability. This is why isolation is paired with permanence. Temporary isolation would only delay disruption. A being might change, circumstances might shift, the threat could re-emerge. Eternal isolation removes time as a factor. Time, in the Sumerian worldview, is not inherently redemptive. Cycles repeat, but they do not correct fundamental incompatibilities. What was disruptive before will be disruptive again if reintroduced. This is why isolation must be eternal. The divine order is not sentimental. It does not believe that everything can be integrated. Some things must remain outside for the rest to remain inside. The underworld again provides a partial analogy. The dead are isolated from the living. They exist eternally in a diminished state. They do not return to influence events. This arrangement is not considered unjust. It is considered necessary. Without it, the boundary between life and death would blur and chaos would follow. Eternal isolation at a cosmic level functions similarly, but it applies to beings whose influence would be catastrophic rather than merely unsettling. The scale changes. The principle does not. When we consider a planet-sized containment zone within this framework, its function becomes clear. It is not a place of punishment in the emotional sense. It is a structural feature. It exists so that the divine order can remain intact without continual conflict. The planet does not need to be hostile. It does not need torment. It does not need guards. Its distance and permanence are sufficient. Distance ensures that no communication occurs. Permanence ensures that no release is expected. Isolation ensures that influence is eliminated. Together, these elements produce stability. The Sumerian tablets repeatedly emphasize that the cosmos was built, not discovered. Heaven and earth were separated deliberately. Domains were assigned intentionally. Boundaries were established with force. The world did not emerge organically into harmony. Harmony was imposed. Eternal isolation is an extension of this logic. Just as the sky holds back the waters above, and the earth holds back the waters below, an isolated realm holds back what must never re-enter circulation. This containment is not passive. It is maintained by decree. The isolation persists because it is part of the cosmic architecture. It does not weaken over time. It does not erode. The permanence of isolation is reinforced by the absence of mythic interest. There are no stories of escape, no prophecies of return, no cycles associated with release. The silence is complete. This silence is itself a function. The Sumerians understood that stories shape expectations. A story of eventual return would undermine the authority of isolation. It would plant doubt. Doubt destabilizes acceptance. Acceptance is necessary for order. By leaving isolation unstoried, the texts prevent speculation. The beings subjected to eternal isolation are not portrayed as victims or villains. They are treated as resolved variables. Once placed, they are no longer part of the equation. This approach reflects a broader administrative mindset visible in Sumerian law, economy and ritual. Records are kept, decisions are finalized, tablets are sealed. What is sealed is not reopened casually. The cosmos itself is treated like an archive. Certain elements are active files, others are closed cases. Eternal isolation closes a case permanently. This also explains why isolation is framed as placement rather than imprisonment. Prison implies eventual release or reform. Placement implies final assignment. The being belongs there now. Its story, in terms of the active world, is complete. The Sumerian divine order does not seek to change the isolated being. It seeks to protect the system from it. This distinction is critical. Modern justice often focuses on rehabilitation. Sumerian cosmic justice focuses on preservation. Preservation of what already works. The function of eternal isolation, then, is not to punish wrongdoing, but to prevent recurrence. It is preventative rather than corrective. Once the threat is removed, there is nothing left to correct. This perspective also clarifies why isolation is described without urgency. There is no countdown, no tension, no expectation of future change. The decision has been made. Time can pass safely. In a universe where gods themselves are subject to rules, eternal isolation reinforces those rules. It demonstrates that no being is above the system. Power does not grant immunity. Influence does not guarantee permanence. Only compatibility ensures continued participation. The existence of an isolated realm, especially one on a planetary scale, communicates this lesson implicitly. The cosmos has limits. Crossing them has consequences that cannot be negotiated away. The Sumerians did not imagine rebellion as heroic. Rebellion threatened irrigation systems, food supplies, and divine favour. It threatened survival. The gods who enforced order were not tyrants in this worldview. They were custodians. Custodians must sometimes lock doors. The door that leads to eternal isolation is not opened lightly, but once closed, it remains closed. This permanence is not emphasized because it is assumed. The system does not plan for its own failure. Eternal isolation also allows memory without danger. The isolated being can be remembered as existing without posing risk. Memory preserves history. Isolation preserves safety. This dual preservation is important. Erasure removes lessons. Isolation preserves them silently. The Sumerians valued memory. They copied tablets for centuries. They preserved names, lists, and genealogies long after their subjects ceased to matter politically. Preservation mattered. Isolation allows preservation without influence. This is why the isolated realms are not erased from cosmology. They are named, they are acknowledged, but they are not engaged. Acknowledgement without engagement is the hallmark of controlled distance. As we move forward, this understanding will illuminate why the tablets avoid describing what happens inside such places, why myths shift away from them, and why later traditions struggle to reinterpret these silences. For now, what matters is recognizing the role eternal isolation plays in divine order. It is not a failure of compassion. It is a feature of stability. The Sumerian universe does not seek perfection. It seeks endurance. Eternal isolation is one of the tools that makes endurance possible. Without it, disruption would accumulate. Conflicts would multiply. The system would require constant correction. With it, the cosmos can remain largely unchanged once balance is restored. That is its function, not punishment, not redemption, not annihilation. Containment, carried out once and never revisited. In a world defined by cycles and fragility, that kind of finality was not frightening. It was necessary. The Sumerian tablets avoid describing life inside certain realms, not because the scribes lacked imagination, and not because information was lost, but because description itself would have undermined the purpose of those places. In a worldview where language establishes reality, where naming fixes function, and where stories create expectation, To describe life inside a containment realm would have been to reopen what was meant to remain closed. This avoidance is deliberate, consistent, and revealing. The Sumerians described many difficult realities in detail. They described famine, disease, war, and death without hesitation. They described the underworld, despite its bleakness, with specificity. Gates are counted, judges are named, rules are explained. Even the suffering of gods and humans is recorded when it serves a structural purpose. Silence, therefore, is never accidental. It is chosen. To understand why the tablets avoid describing life inside such places, it is necessary to understand what description does in Sumerian thought. Description is not neutral. To describe is to define. To define is to integrate. Once something is integrated into language and narrative, it becomes part of the active system. It gains relevance. A place designed to remove relevance must therefore resist description. If life inside a containment realm were described, even briefly, it would invite comparison. Comparison leads to empathy. Empathy leads to curiosity. Curiosity leads to speculation. Speculation leads to the possibility of return, rebellion, or moral doubt. All of this would weaken the finality that containment is meant to achieve. The tablets are careful not to make this mistake. Instead of describing what happens inside such realms, the texts describe what happens outside after placement occurs. Order resumes, councils dissolve, agriculture continues, time moves forward. The focus shifts deliberately away from the contained and back to the functioning world. This narrative redirection is not an omission. It is instruction. The scribes are teaching the reader where attention belongs. Attention is a form of power. What receives attention participates in the system. What is denied attention fades from relevance. This principle appears throughout Sumerian culture. Names of defeated enemies disappear from records. Failed dynasties are mentioned briefly and then dropped. Gods who lose prominence receive fewer hymns. Silence follows loss of influence. Silence is not forgetting. It is containment at the level of memory. Describing life inside a containment realm would preserve that life as a topic of thought. Thought sustains relevance. Relevance invites engagement. Engagement threatens closure. The Sumerians understood this intuitively. They also understood that suffering, once described, becomes meaningful in a way that challenges authority. A suffering figure can become sympathetic. Sympathy can destabilize acceptance of judgment. This is why even when punishment is severe, the tablets rarely dwell on the internal experience of the punished. The focus remains on outcome, not sensation. This is especially important in cases where judgment does not end in death. A being that continues to exist could easily become the subject of narrative. Stories of endurance, resistance, or despair could develop. These stories would imply that the being's existence still matters. The tablets refuse this implication. By avoiding any description of life inside such places, the scribes ensure that continued existence does not translate into continued significance. The being exists, but nothing about that existence is narratively accessible. This is a powerful form of erasure without destruction. It also reflects a broader Sumerian discomfort with unbounded imagination. Imagination, when unconstrained, can lead to transgression. Many myths warn against seeking forbidden knowledge, crossing assigned boundaries, or exceeding one's role. Description can encourage exactly this kind of mental crossing. By keeping certain realms undescribed, the texts prevent mental trespass. The underworld again provides a useful contrast. It is described because it must be understood. Death is universal. Rituals for the dead matter. The living must know what happens after death to behave properly in life. Description serves function. A containment realm serves a different function. It removes. It does not instruct the living how to behave, except indirectly through its existence. Its details are irrelevant to daily life. Only its role matters. This distinction explains why the tablets are content to say that a being was sent, placed, or assigned, and then say nothing further. The event itself completes the narrative requirement. What happens afterward does not affect the system. Modern readers often feel discomfort with this silence. We are accustomed to stories that follow characters to their end, that explore interior states, that seek closure through understanding. The Sumerian worldview does not prioritize this kind of closure. Structural closure is enough. Understanding what happens inside a containment realm would not improve the functioning of the world. It would only satisfy curiosity. Curiosity is not valued when it threatens stability. This is not anti-intellectualism. It is selective attention. The Sumerians recorded astronomical observations with precision. They catalogued omens meticulously. They developed mathematics, law, and writing itself. They valued knowledge deeply. But they distinguished between knowledge that sustains order and knowledge that destabilizes it. Life inside a realm of eternal isolation falls into the second category. Describing it would raise questions that have no acceptable answers within the system. Is the isolation fair? Does the being suffer? Could the being change? Should the being be released? These questions would challenge the finality of divine decree. The tablets do not open this door. This avoidance also protects the authority of the gods. Divine decisions are presented as correct by definition, not because the gods are morally perfect, but because the system depends on acceptance of their decrees. Questioning divine judgment at a cosmic level would erode the legitimacy of order itself. Silence ensures compliance without argument. The scribes were not naive. They understood that silence can speak louder than explanation. A place that is acknowledged but never described becomes psychologically distant. It fades from imagination. It becomes background architecture rather than narrative focus. Architecture does not invite empathy. It invites acceptance. This is why the containment realm, whatever its scale, is treated architecturally rather than narratively. It is part of the structure of the universe, like the sky, the earth, or the underworld. One does not ask what life is like inside a wall. One accepts that the wall exists. The tablets reinforce this by maintaining consistency across generations of copying. The silence persists. No later scribe attempts to fill it in. No variant introduces detail. This consistency suggests a shared understanding that certain things were not to be elaborated. This shared understanding is itself evidence of function. If the lack of description were accidental, we would expect variation. Some scribes would speculate. Some myths would expand. None do. The restraint holds. This also suggests that any oral traditions that might have elaborated on such realms were deliberately excluded from written form. Writing for the Sumerians carried authority. What was written became fixed. Leaving something unwritten preserved flexibility and prevented legitimization of speculation. In other words, silence was a safeguard. The avoidance of describing life inside containment realms also prevents identification. Identification leads to projection. Projection leads to moral complexity. Moral complexity is destabilizing in a system that prioritizes order over introspection. The Sumerian cosmos does not ask the reader to feel with the isolated. It asks the reader to understand why isolation exists. Understanding does not require imagery. This approach also aligns with how Sumerian law handles punishment. Legal texts list penalties without dramatization. They specify outcomes, not experiences. The law is concerned with enforcement, not emotion. Cosmic law operates the same way. The tablets treat divine order as an extension of administrative logic. Things are placed where they belong. Once placed, they are no longer discussed. This may feel unsettling, but it is internally consistent. It also explains why later cultures struggled with these silences. Later traditions, more focused on moral narrative and redemption, filled the gaps with stories of suffering, rebellion, and eventual release. These additions reflect different priorities, not original intent. The Sumerian intent is visible precisely in what is missing. By avoiding description of life inside containment realms, the tablets prevent those realms from becoming mythic spaces of fascination. They remain functional nodes in a system, not stages for drama. This restraint protects the living world from obsession with what lies beyond acceptable boundaries. The Sumerians lived with constant reminders of fragility. Floods, droughts, and disease could undo decades of labour. In such a context, stability was precious. Anything that encouraged fixation on unreachable realms or unresolved judgments would distract from survival. The tablets reflect this pragmatism. They teach indirectly that some things are not worth knowing, not because they are false, but because knowing them would not help. This is a difficult lesson for modern audiences, accustomed to the idea that all knowledge is beneficial. The Sumerian worldview disagrees. Knowledge has weight. Some knowledge destabilizes. The avoidance of describing life inside containment realms is therefore an ethical choice within that worldview. It preserves order by limiting imagination. It preserves authority by avoiding critique. It preserves stability by closing narrative loops cleanly. And it preserves function by keeping attention focused where it matters. A planet-sized prison, understood in this context, does not need description. Its existence is enough. Its role is clear. Its contents are irrelevant to the functioning world. To describe life inside it would be to mistake existence for relevance. The Sumerians did not make that mistake. They acknowledged what must be acknowledged, and then they moved on. That movement, away from the isolated and back toward the living world, is not neglect. It is the final step of containment. Once something is placed beyond the boundary, language itself withdraws. And in a culture where language creates order, that withdrawal is the most complete form of closure possible. The tablets do not describe life inside such realms, because within the logic of Sumerian thought, life there no longer matters, not because it is empty, but because it has been removed from the story the world continues to tell. In later mythologies, traces of the Sumerian concept of containment begin to surface, but they do so in altered forms, softened by narrative, moralized by theology, and reshaped to suit different cultural priorities. These later myths rarely preserve the original austerity of the Sumerian worldview. Instead, they echo it indirectly, transforming structural isolation into stories of punishment, rebellion, or moral failure. What remains consistent, however, is the underlying idea that some beings are not destroyed, but removed, confined, and prevented from returning. These echoes are not identical repetitions, they are distortions. But distortions only occur when there is an original shape to distort. As Mesopotamian ideas spread and evolved, later cultures inherited fragments rather than systems. The clean administrative logic of the Sumerian cosmos gradually gave way to more dramatic narratives. Silence was filled with story. Placement became imprisonment. Isolation became suffering. What had once been procedural became moral. Yet beneath these changes, the same core function persists. In later myths, gods or powerful beings who threaten order are often confined rather than annihilated. They are bound beneath the earth, chained to remote locations, sealed behind gates, or cast into distant realms from which return is impossible without catastrophe. These are not inventions of cruelty. They are adaptations of an older logic that understood containment as safer than destruction. The shift is subtle but important. Where Sumerian texts emphasize placement, later myths emphasize resistance. Where Sumerian silence avoids interior description, later traditions imagine torment. Where Sumerian order assumes permanence, later myths introduce hope of escape or eventual release. This change reflects a difference in worldview, not contradiction of the original concept. As cultures moved away from strict administrative cosmology toward moral storytelling, isolation had to be justified emotionally. A being could no longer simply be placed. It had to deserve confinement in a way that made sense within a moral framework. Suffering became proof of justice. Narrative replaced structure. But the location remained distant. The separation remained absolute. The return remained forbidden or catastrophic. These later myths often situate confinement at the edges of the world or beyond it, beneath mountains, at the ends of seas, beyond the sky. The geography varies, but the function does not. The place exists outside normal circulation. It does not participate in daily life. It does not interact unless something goes terribly wrong. This is the same logic the Sumerians applied, expressed in different language. What changes most noticeably is attention. Later myths linger on the confined. They describe chains, darkness, suffering, and rebellion. They give voice to what the Sumerians kept silent. This shift says more about later audiences than about the original concept. As societies became more concerned with individual morality and redemption, they needed stories that explored interior states. The Sumerian worldview did not require this exploration. Order was enough. The persistence of confinement myths across cultures suggests that the idea of eternal isolation filled a structural need in ancient thought. Destruction alone could not account for the continued existence of danger in memory. Nor could temporary punishment guarantee safety. A place that permanently removed threats without erasing them entirely offered a solution that could be adapted to many belief systems. As these ideas travelled, they accumulated narrative detail. Chains replaced distance, guards replaced closure, fire replaced silence, but the purpose remained unchanged. Even when later myths introduced the possibility of release, that release is framed as catastrophic. The return of the confined threatens the world. Chaos follows. This reinforces the original Sumerian assumption that isolation was necessary and that breaking it is dangerous. The fear attached to such releases does not arise from moral outrage. It arises from structural instability. The system cannot absorb the return of what was removed. This is a direct inheritance from the Sumerian model. Later myths also tend to locate these confinement realms in cosmic geography. They are not merely underground prisons. They are woven into the structure of the universe. Their existence explains why certain dangers do not actively trouble the world. They are accounted for, held somewhere else. This explanatory function mirrors the role of the Sumerian containment realm. It reassures the living that order persists because threats have been addressed. What is lost in later myths is restraint. The Sumerian refusal to describe life inside containment is replaced by fascination. Audiences want to know what happens there, writers oblige. But this curiosity transforms the function of the place. It becomes a stage for drama rather than a silent solution. The Sumerian scribes avoided this transformation intentionally. When we see later myths struggling to reconcile the existence of eternal confinement with moral ideals, we are witnessing a tension that did not exist in the original framework. The Sumerians did not require moral justification beyond functionality. Later cultures did. This tension produces stories of unjust imprisonment, tragic rebellion, and eventual liberation. These stories are compelling, but they represent a departure from the original logic. The echo remains audible, however, in the insistence that some beings must remain confined for the world to function. Even when moral discomfort arises, the conclusion is the same. Release is dangerous. The persistence of this conclusion across cultures suggests that the idea of cosmic containment addressed a universal concern. How does a system remain stable when faced with forces too powerful to destroy? The answer, again and again, is removal without erasure. This answer did not originate in later myths. It originated in the administrative cosmology of the earliest Mesopotamian texts. The echoes become fainter as time passes, but they do not disappear. Even in traditions that emphasize forgiveness and transformation, the idea of an ultimate containment remains. There is always a place where certain forces are held at bay, permanently or until a final reckoning. The Sumerian model does not include final reckoning, it includes maintenance. Later cultures reinterpret maintenance as postponement. This shift changes the emotional tone, but not the underlying structure. When we strip away narrative additions, moral framing, and symbolic language, what remains is familiar, a distant place, a sealed boundary, a being removed from circulation. Silence. This continuity suggests that the Sumerian concept was not merely a local mythological invention. It was a functional model that proved adaptable across time and belief systems. The reason later myths feel compelled to revisit these containment realms, to describe them, to dramatize them, is precisely because the Sumerian texts did not. The silence invited reinterpretation once the original worldview loosened its grip, but the original silence remains instructive. The Sumerians did not need to explain why such a place existed. Its existence was self-evident within a system built on order. Later myths had to justify it because their systems were built on morality. This difference explains why later traditions often struggle with the idea of eternal confinement. They want resolution. The Sumerian cosmos does not. The echo of a prison concept in later myths is therefore not evidence of a shared fascination with punishment. It is evidence of a shared recognition that some problems cannot be solved through destruction or dialogue. They must be isolated. The forms change. The language changes. The emotional framing changes. But the function persists, a place that holds what must not return, a boundary that remains closed, a silence that ensures stability. These are the echoes, and they point back not to a dramatic story, but to a quiet solution that the earlier scribes believed was necessary for the world to continue. As we move closer to the end of this exploration, the contrast between the Sumerian restraint and later mythic elaboration becomes sharper. The more later cultures talk about containment, the clearer it becomes why the Sumerians chose not to. They trusted the system. They trusted silence. And they trusted that some structures do not need stories to justify their existence. They only need to work. When punishment becomes cosmic, its purpose changes. It stops being a response to individual wrongdoing and becomes a method of maintaining the structure of reality itself. In the Sumerian worldview, this shift is subtle but decisive. Punishment is no longer concerned with correction, deterrence, or moral balance at the level of persons. It becomes a structural tool, applied only when the stability of the entire system is at stake. At this scale, punishment is not reactive. It is preventative. The difference can be felt immediately in the language of the tablets. Ordinary punishment is described in relation to acts. A boundary is crossed. A rule is broken. A response follows. Cosmic punishment, by contrast, is described in relation to imbalance. Something does not belong where it is. Something exists in a way that threatens the continuity of order. The response is not framed as retribution. It is framed as correction of placement. This distinction matters because it removes emotion from the process. Cosmic punishment is not angry. It is deliberate. It does not escalate. It resolves. When a punishment reaches cosmic scale, the question is no longer what was done, but what will happen if nothing is done. The focus shifts from past behaviour to future stability. This forward-looking orientation explains why cosmic punishment often appears disproportionate when judged by human standards. The severity is not calibrated to offence, it is calibrated to risk. Risk, in this context, is not abstract. The Sumerians lived in a world where small disruptions could produce catastrophic outcomes. A breach in a levee could destroy an entire harvest. A misjudged ritual could anger a god and bring drought. A failed king could destabilize a city-state. Scale mattered. Containment mattered. Cosmic punishment reflects this awareness. It is applied only when the potential consequences of continued existence within the system outweigh the cost of removal. Once punishment becomes cosmic, several things change at once. First, individuality dissolves. The punished being is no longer treated as a character with motives, emotions, or interior experience. It becomes a variable in a system. This is why the tablets do not explore personal guilt or regret at this level. Guilt implies moral accounting. Cosmic punishment is not moral accounting. It is systems management. Second, time ceases to matter in the usual way. Human punishment is often limited by duration. A sentence is served. A penalty is paid. Cosmic punishment has no term. It is not meant to end. The duration is indefinite because the condition it addresses is permanent. This permanence is not emphasized because it is assumed. A cosmic decision does not anticipate reversal. Third, location becomes everything. Cosmic punishment is spatial. It involves placement rather than action. The being is moved, fixed, or stationed somewhere outside the active network of cause and effect. This spatialization of punishment reflects the Sumerian belief that order itself is spatially arranged. Heaven, earth, and underworld each have roles. Cosmic punishment assigns a being to a space where its role becomes null. This is why destruction is avoided. Destruction would remove a variable entirely, potentially destabilizing the balance of forces. Placement preserves existence while neutralizing effect. Fourth, narrative attention shifts away from the punished. This is perhaps the most striking change. Human punishment often becomes a story. Trials are told, crimes are remembered, consequences are narrated. Cosmic punishment ends the story. Once placement occurs, the narrative moves on. Attention returns to the functioning world. This shift teaches the audience how to think about order. The punished being is not meant to be contemplated. It is meant to be forgotten in practice, even if remembered in record. Fifth, authority becomes impersonal. At the cosmic level, punishment is not enacted by a single god acting in anger. It is enacted by decree. Councils deliberate. Decisions are recorded. The act carries legitimacy because it reflects collective order rather than individual will. This impersonal authority reinforces acceptance. The decision is not arbitrary, it is structural. When punishment becomes cosmic, it also changes how fear operates. Fear is no longer about suffering, it is about removal. The fear is not of pain, but of irrelevance. To be removed from participation in the cosmic order is the ultimate loss in a system where identity is defined by function. This is why cosmic punishment does not need spectacle. Spectacle would be wasted. The severity lies in the outcome, not in the experience. Another change occurs in how memory functions. Human punishment often relies on memory to deter. The story of punishment is told to warn others. Cosmic punishment relies on memory differently. The existence of the containment realm is known, but the details are not shared. The lesson is implicit. Some boundaries cannot be crossed without permanent consequence. The lack of detail is intentional. Detail would invite curiosity. Curiosity could weaken restraint. Cosmic punishment also alters the relationship between power and accountability. At lower levels, power can shield individuals from consequence. Kings can avoid judgment. Gods can defy one another. At the cosmic level, power itself becomes the problem. The more powerful a being is, the more dangerous its misalignment becomes. Cosmic punishment is therefore most likely to apply to the most powerful entities. This reverses a common assumption. Instead of power granting immunity, power increases risk. The more influence a being has, the more carefully it must be managed. The tablets imply this without stating it outright. The beings subject to eternal isolation are not minor figures. They are not insignificant. They are removed precisely because they matter too much. This logic also explains why cosmic punishment is rare. It is not applied frequently because it is costly in a structural sense. Removing a powerful being from circulation alters the balance of forces. Such a change is not undertaken lightly. It is reserved for situations where continued participation would be worse. The rarity of cosmic punishment reinforces its authority. Because it is uncommon, its existence carries weight. When punishment becomes cosmic, it also reshapes the moral landscape. Moral categories like guilt, innocence, and repentance lose relevance. The question is not whether the punished deserves compassion. The question is whether the system can survive their continued presence. This does not mean morality disappears entirely. It means morality operates at a different level. Justice becomes synonymous with stability. A just outcome is one in which order endures. This perspective can feel unsettling, especially when contrasted with later traditions that emphasize individual moral worth. But within the Sumerian worldview, it is coherent. Survival at scale requires decisions that prioritize continuity over sentiment. Cosmic punishment also clarifies the role of silence. Silence is not neglect, it is enforcement. By refusing to elaborate on the fate of the isolated, the tablets prevent the emergence of counter-narratives. There is no martyrdom, no sympathy, no rallying point. Silence protects the decision. This protection extends across generations. Scribes copy the silence faithfully. The absence becomes tradition. The tradition becomes authority. When punishment becomes cosmic, it also changes the relationship between the living world and the unknown. The unknown is no longer a frontier. It is a boundary. Beyond certain points, curiosity is not encouraged. The cosmos is not presented as something to be explored endlessly. It is presented as something to be respected and maintained. This contrasts sharply with modern assumptions about progress and exploration. The Sumerian cosmos is not open-ended. It is closed by design. A planet-sized containment realm fits naturally into this closed system. It represents a solution that does not require ongoing negotiation. Once something is placed there, the system no longer needs to account for it. The scale of the punishment reflects the scale of the threat. Human misbehavior is addressed locally. Divine or cosmic misalignment is addressed globally. This scaling is consistent. It reveals a worldview that understands proportion not in terms of suffering, but in terms of impact. Another important change is that cosmic punishment removes ambiguity. Human punishment is often contested. Appeals are made. Mitigating circumstances are considered. Cosmic punishment allows no appeal. The decision is final because the stakes are absolute. Finality is not emphasized because it is built into the structure. The cosmos does not plan for its own revision. This finality also explains why cosmic punishment does not produce ongoing conflict. There are no wars to reverse it, no movements to overturn it. The place itself enforces compliance. The boundary holds because it is part of the architecture. When punishment becomes cosmic, it also reshapes how hope functions. Hope, in the human sense, is tied to change. Cosmic punishment eliminates change as a factor. This does not make the cosmos hopeless. It makes it stable. Stability for the Sumerians was a greater good than hope. The living world depends on predictability. Rivers must flood at the right time. Seasons must return. The sun must rise. Cosmic punishment removes unpredictable variables permanently. This is why the punishment is not revisited. Revisiting would imply uncertainty. The Sumerian worldview accepts that some things must be fixed forever, so that others can continue to change safely. This acceptance is visible in the calm tone of the tablets. There is no triumph in cosmic punishment. There is no sorrow. There is only acknowledgement. The acknowledgement itself is enough. When punishment becomes cosmic, it ceases to be a story about wrongdoers. It becomes a story about the world that remains. The focus shifts to continuity. Fields are planted, cities endure, rituals continue, time passes. The punished being fades into the background, not because it is forgotten, but because it no longer matters. This is perhaps the most profound change of all. Cosmic punishment redefines what it means to matter. To matter is to participate. Once participation ends, existence alone is insufficient to sustain relevance. The Sumerians understood this deeply. Their society depended on participation. Everyone had a role. Farmers farmed, priests performed rituals, kings ruled, gods governed. To lose one's role was to lose one's place in the world. Cosmic punishment removes role entirely. This removal is not framed as cruelty. It is framed as necessity. As we approach the end of this exploration, this understanding will be crucial. The final reflection will not ask whether cosmic punishment is right or wrong. That question does not belong to the Sumerian worldview. Instead, it will ask what it means to live in a universe where some decisions are final, some boundaries are absolute, and some places exist solely so that the rest of the system can continue undisturbed. For now, what matters is recognizing the shift. When punishment becomes cosmic, it stops being about correction and becomes about containment. It stops being about the individual and becomes about the system. It stops being about suffering and becomes about silence. And once that shift occurs, the universe described by the tablets becomes clearer. Not a place of endless conflict and drama, but a structure designed to endure, even if endurance requires that some things be placed forever beyond reach. As everything we have moved through settles, there is a final idea that lingers quietly beneath the surface of the tablets, never stated outright, never argued for, yet present in the structure of everything they describe. The universe the Sumerians imagined was not built only to create, nourish, and sustain. It was also built to contain, not as an afterthought, not as a reaction, as part of its original design. This is difficult to accept because it runs against modern instincts. We tend to imagine order as something that emerges through balance alone, through harmony, through cooperation and adjustment. The Sumerian worldview suggests something sterner. Order is not self-maintaining. It requires boundaries that do not yield. It requires places where problems do not get resolved, but removed. It requires somewhere for what cannot be integrated to go. The tablets never say this directly. They do not announce a cosmic prison. They do not describe its walls, its contents, or its conditions. Instead, they build a universe where such a place is unavoidable. A universe with layers, thresholds, closures, and irreversible decisions. A universe where death is not the only end, where silence is more final than destruction, and where existence can continue without relevance. If the universe was designed with somewhere to lock things away, then containment is not a failure of compassion. It is a feature of endurance. The Sumerians lived in a world where survival depended on systems working reliably. Irrigation had to function year after year. Seasons had to return. Social roles had to be respected. The breakdown of any one of these could mean famine or collapse. Their cosmology reflects that reality. It is practical at a scale that extends beyond human life. In such a universe, not everything can be healed, not everything can be taught, not everything can be allowed to remain within circulation. Some things, once proven incompatible, must be removed so that everything else can continue. This is why the concept of containment appears again and again, not as spectacle, but as infrastructure. It is quiet. It does not draw attention. It does not require storytelling. It simply exists, doing its work without commentary. A place that receives and does not give back. A realm that is named but never visited. A destination that ends narratives rather than creating them. These are not gaps in the record. They are deliberate absences. The Sumerian scribes were not trying to frighten future readers. They were recording how the world works. Their calm tone is not indifference. It is acceptance. Acceptance that stability sometimes requires permanence. Acceptance that authority sometimes requires finality. Acceptance that the universe is not obligated to redeem everything that exists within it. In this worldview, freedom is not the highest value. Continuity is. The idea that the universe includes a place where influence stops, where interaction ends, and where existence becomes inert is unsettling precisely because it feels impersonal. There is no appeal, no transformation, no return. But impersonal systems are often the most stable ones. Rivers do not negotiate, seasons do not apologize, gravity does not explain itself. The Sumerian cosmos behaves the same way. This perspective also reframes silence. Silence is not ignorance, it is restraint. By refusing to describe life inside places of containment, the tablets prevent fixation. They prevent mythic inflation. They prevent the imagination from turning removal into drama. Drama invites identification. Identification invites sympathy. Sympathy invites challenge. The scribes did not want challenge. They wanted order. Silence is how order protects itself. When later cultures encountered these ideas, they struggled with that silence. They filled it with suffering, rebellion, and hope. These additions reveal a discomfort with finality. The Sumerians did not share that discomfort. They accepted that some decisions do not need narrative justification. The world continues. That is justification enough. If the universe was designed with somewhere to lock things away, then it was designed with limits in mind. Limits on power, limits on influence, limits on what can be allowed to circulate indefinitely. This does not mean the universe is cruel, it means it is cautious. Caution, in the Sumerian worldview, is wisdom. Their gods are not reckless, they deliberate, they argue, they issue decrees. When they act decisively, it is because deliberation has ended. The placement of a being beyond reach is not impulsive. It is the last step after all others have failed. Once that step is taken, the system no longer looks back. This is why the finality feels so complete. There is no lingering tension, no unresolved conflict. The narrative energy moves elsewhere. The reader is guided back toward the living world, toward fields and cities and rituals and time. The containment realm fades into background architecture. That fading is essential. A universe that constantly reminded its inhabitants of its prisons would be a universe obsessed with fear. The Sumerian universe is not obsessed, it is composed. Fear exists, but it is disciplined. It teaches respect for boundaries, not fascination with transgression. The existence of a cosmic containment zone also changes how responsibility is understood. If the universe itself has a place to remove irreconcilable forces, then order does not depend entirely on perpetual vigilance. It has fail-safes. It has redundancies. This would have been comforting to a civilization surrounded by uncertainty. Floods could come without warning. Droughts could last for years. Empires could fall. Against this backdrop, a cosmos that included permanent solutions would feel reliable rather than oppressive. The idea that something powerful could be neutralized forever without destroying the world would inspire confidence in the system. Confidence matters. A society that believes order can be maintained is more likely to invest in building, preserving, and transmitting knowledge. The Sumerians did exactly that. They wrote, they copied, they archived, they planned for generations they would never meet. Their cosmology mirrors that long view. Containment is not about punishment. It is about inheritance. It ensures that what threatens continuity does not return to disrupt it later. It protects the future by isolating the past. This also explains why memory is preserved without engagement. Names remain in lists, places remain acknowledged. The system remembers what it has done without reopening it. Memory without interaction is another form of containment. The universe, as described by the tablets, is not a place of infinite possibility. It is a place of managed possibility. Some paths are open, others are closed forever. Knowing the difference is part of wisdom. The Sumerians did not imagine that everything could be explored. Exploration was not a virtue in itself. Survival was. The sky was not freedom. It was a boundary. Distance was not mystery. It was removal. Silence was not absence, it was closure. If the universe was designed with somewhere to lock things away, then that design reflects a deep understanding of risk. Some risks cannot be mitigated, they can only be isolated. Modern thought often resists this idea. We prefer solutions that promise eventual integration, but integration assumes compatibility. The Sumerian worldview does not assume compatibility as universal. Some things do not belong together. The existence of a cosmic containment zone acknowledges this without apology. It also reframes the meaning of justice. Justice is not always restoration. Sometimes it is separation. Sometimes it is the protection of many at the cost of removing one from relevance forever. This is not framed as tragic because tragedy implies loss. The Sumerian texts do not treat removal as loss. They treat it as correction. The corrected world continues to function. That continuation is the ultimate measure of success. As this quiet thought settles, there is no conclusion to draw in the modern sense. The tablets do not ask agreement. They do not ask approval. They simply present a universe that works in a particular way. A universe with thresholds that do not reopen. A universe with silence that is intentional. A universe with places that exist so everything else can continue safely. If such a place exists, it does not need attention. Attention would defeat its purpose. It needs distance. It needs quiet. It needs permanence. And in the Sumerian imagination, permanence was not frightening. It was reassuring. Because a world that endures is a world where most things remain where they belong. And anything that does not belong, no matter how powerful, has somewhere else to go. Not to be destroyed, not to be redeemed. Simply to be placed, held, and removed from the story the living world continues to tell. That thought does not demand reflection or response. It does not ask to be resolved. It is meant to rest quietly in the background, like the structures the Sumerians believed held the universe together. Stable, unseen, and doing their work without needing to be spoken of again. As the world goes on.